For a year, he counted the days inside the great dungeon. He counted them just as he had counted inventory in his previous life. And on the 60th floor, he calculated his annual salary. 2 gold pieces. Less than a single night in a hotel. And then he stopped counting other people's money. Daniel Kim woke up on a cold stone beneath a glowing canopy of green moss. 6 figures in armor stood above him, looking down. One sat down beside him. Golden hair, a white cloak with a crest of a star and a sword. He introduced himself as Marcus Steele, leader of the Starblade Party. He said Daniel had been summoned to the world of Aerdall. He said a mission awaited them from all the guilds of the continent. To descend into the great dungeon and destroy the catastrophe rising from below. Marcus pulled him to his feet and asked what class he had been assigned during the transfer. Daniel looked inside himself and found a single word: Shopkeeper. He said it aloud. The 6 exchanged glances. Someone snorted. The archer looked at him with pity, but Marcus just kept smiling and said that every class is important. And that's when Daniel sensed something familiar. In 6 years in retail, he'd learned one thing. When the boss smiles and says you're important, it means they've already written you off. A year to go. 365 days. He counted them the same way he counted inventory. The party hacked their way down through icy caves, mushroom forests, underground lakes, and creatures that made your fingers go numb. Marcus hacked away. The tank took the brunt of the attack. The mage cast fire. The archer shot. The priest healed. The swordswoman covered the flanks. And Daniel stood behind them, holding the bags. Literally holding the bags. His class provided exactly one thing. He saw the value in things. He looked at the hide of a slain creature and knew it was material for winter gloves selling for 12 silver each on the 45th floor. He looked at a crystal from a golem and knew that merchants in Bronzebone bought them for 3 and sold them for 9. He knew where a flask of water cost 5 copper coins and where it cost 40. He knew that Marcus was paying 3 times the going rate to have his sword repaired because he didn't haggle. Over the course of a year, he saved the squad 800 gold pieces. That money could sustain an average squad for 4 months. No one noticed. He cooked the meals. He mended clothes. He repaired tents. He kept track of 23 potion suppliers and every merchant at every stop. A database. Accurate. Living. Useless to those who settle everything with a sword. The 60th floor. A rest stop before the descent. Marcus gathered everyone around the fire. His face was serious. His voice was soft. In a past life, bosses used that voice to begin the phrase that ended careers. Marcus said the most dangerous floors lay ahead, that everyone must contribute to the fight, that he respected Daniel and was grateful for everything. And then he struck with the words Daniel had heard 3 days earlier, in the way Marcus looked at him by every campfire. You're holding the group back. A real fighter is more useful on the front lines. Go back up. And one word from above. I'm sorry. Daniel glanced around at them. The tank was silent. The mage was silent. The priest was silent. The swordswoman was silent. The archer opened her mouth and said it wasn't right. Marcus turned to her and snapped that the decision had been made. She fell silent. Daniel nodded. He stood up. He slung his backpack over his shoulders. It took 4 minutes because the backpack was always packed. He shoved a stack of parchments into Marcus's hands. A list of supplies with notes on where to buy more and at what price. Marcus took them without looking. Daniel turned and headed upstairs. No one called out to him. He walked for 12 days, from the 60th floor to the 38th, through corridors he knew by heart. On the 55th floor, he bought hardtack for 3 days. On the 50th, he spent the night in an empty rest stop. He skirted fields of glowing mushrooms the size of houses and the territory of stone wolves, alone, unarmed except for a knife for butchering trophies. He walked and counted, not days, money. 200 copper coins, a year's salary. Marcus paid his fighters 20 gold coins a month. Daniel 200 copper coins a year, 100 copper coins to 1 gold coin. So his year was worth 2 gold pieces, less than a night in a decent hotel. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was counting. On the 38th floor, he stopped. Not from fatigue, he had seen what he was looking for. A fork and 3 tunnels off the path to the bronze bone. The left one led to the city, the right one deeper into the unknown. The middle one was a dead end. So it was believed. The route had been written off as unprofitable 2 months ago. Scavenging harpies had taken up residence 1 floor above and blocked the short path upward. The caravans had stopped, the merchants had left, the place had died. Daniel dropped his backpack on a rock and looked around. A wide, dry niche in the wall. A draft blew through a crack in the ceiling. 20 paces away, a dried-up spring. He walked over, crouched down, and studied the walls. Veins of moisture ran upward and to the right. The spring hadn't died. It had become clogged. Rock had blocked the channel. Judging by the geology of the walls, it would take 3 days to clear with a pickaxe. He returned to the niche, sat down, and took out a clean parchment and a piece of charcoal. He wrote it down neatly. Point number 1, floor 38, the bronze bone fork. Opening in 7 days. Location, trash. Traffic, none. No competitors. Starting capital, 200 copper coins and the reputation of an exiled cart driver. The plan was simple. Survive the first month, turn a profit by the 12th. Daniel looked at the parchment. He looked at the empty fork. He looked into the 3 dark tunnels. And for the first time in a year, he smiled. 7 days. Daniel gave himself exactly 7 days to prepare and worked around the clock like in the old days, when he was launching a new Handmart branch and slept 4 hours a night in the back room. Day 1 was spent at the spring. He found a rusty pickaxe with a cracked handle in an abandoned caravan camp. He wrapped the handle with a strip of leather from an old backpack strap. He began chiseling at the rock. The work was dull and monotonous. Strike, strike, blow. The sedimentary rock crumbled slowly. By the evening of the first day, his shoulders were aching and the calluses on both palms were bleeding. The block wasn't meant for physical labor. His body wouldn't obey him. His muscles were on fire. But Daniel remembered how, during his first month at Handmart, he'd unloaded trucks by hand because the forklift had broken down and the supplier couldn't wait. The body gets used to it. You just have to keep going. By the end of the second day, he had broken through the channel. Water trickled out in a thin stream, murky, dirty, but it was flowing. He widened the channel by another palm's width and left it overnight. By the morning of the third day, the water was flowing clear and cold. He tasted it. It had a mineral flavor with a slight hint of iron. A good taste. A taste that adventurers accustomed to drinking musty water from canteens would appreciate. He made a mental note. Water would become the anchor product. Not the most profitable, but the most important. People would come for water and leave with something else. The third and fourth days were spent on construction. Construction was a bit of an exaggeration. He cleared the niche of rocks, leveled the floor. From the debris of rock and clay he found near the spring, he built a low wall up to his waist. It was a counter, crooked, rough, but functional. Behind the counter, he hung a rag canopy made from a spare tent flap he'd been carrying in his backpack. Not for looks, to keep the merchandise from being fully visible from the road. An old trick from visual merchandising. A person has to come closer to get a look. Getting closer means making contact. Making contact means a 30% chance of a sale instead of 5. Day 5 was spent on inventory. Daniel had no inventory. He had 200 copper coins. With that money, he could buy exactly 25 vials of low-grade potion at the Bronze Bone, at 8 copper coins each. That was his entire starting stock. But Daniel didn't go to the Bronze Bone. He went the other way. A half-hour's walk from the fork in the lower tier of the 38th lived an old herbalist named Myrna. Daniel knew about her because he had passed by here with a group a year ago and remembered her. Myrna gathered mountain moss and the roots of underground vines and brewed an ointment for burns from them. The ointment was good, better than the lowest-grade potion for burn wounds. But Myrna sold it for 3 copper coins a jar because she didn't know the real price and because almost no one came to her. Daniel came to her with a proposal. He said he would buy it from her for 5 copper coins a jar, more than she was asking. Myrna looked at him suspiciously. She asked what the catch was. Daniel explained. There was no catch. He would sell her ointment for more, but because he reached customers who... She gets a steady income. He gets a profit margin. Both come out ahead. Myrna thought for a minute. Then she asked how many jars he needed. Daniel said 10 a week to start with. He paid in advance for the first 10, 50 copper coins. That left 150. On the way back, he found a second supplier. Not a person, a place. Halfway between the fork in the road and Myrna's den, there were bushes of silvery grass that the locals called chili grass. Daniel knew that when brewed, chili grass produced an infusion that relieved fever and headaches. It cost nothing because it grew everywhere, and no one considered it a commodity. Daniel gathered 2 sacks. He dried them on the rocks by the spring. He divided it into portions and placed them in small cloth bags he had sewn from scraps of his tent. He ended up with 40 servings of tea. The cost of each was 0 copper coins. He set the price at 1 copper coin per serving. 1 copper coin is nothing, but 40 servings a week is 40 copper coins, pure profit. He spent the 6th day getting organized. He laid out the goods on the counter. On the left, low-grade potions. In the center, Myrna's burn ointment. On the right, cold water tea. Separately, at the edge of the counter, stood a clay bowl with salted water and a pinch of sugar, which he had haggled for from Myrna for 10 copper coins. A rehydration solution. The cost of a single glass was less than half a copper coin. The selling price was 1 copper coin. He hung a board above the counter. He found a flat piece of slate and scratched a list on it with a piece of charcoal. Potions 8, burn ointment 10, tea 1, salt water 1. Menu. The first menu in the history of the land with prices on a board. In Bronzebone, merchants called out prices, different ones for everyone. They looked at the clothes, at the weapons, at the facial expression. If the customer looked rich, the price went up. If poor, it went up too, because a poor person wouldn't argue. Daniel knew this trick. It worked in the short term. In the long term, it destroyed trust. And trust in retail was worth more than any profit margin. Day 7. Morning. Daniel got up before dawn. He washed up at the spring, put on his apron, a clean one. He washed it every evening and dried it on a rock by the warm wall. He stood behind the counter. He waited. No one came for the first 3 hours. The fork in the road was deserted. Caravans didn't pass through here. The route was considered dangerous and pointless. Daniel stood behind the counter and waited. He knew how to wait. At Hanmart, a new store in a bad location usually started bringing in traffic by the 2nd week. Sometimes by the 3rd. The main thing was not to close early. By the 4th hour, he heard footsteps, heavy, uneven. Someone was coming from the upper floors, walking and stumbling. Daniel straightened up behind the counter and watched. A man emerged from the tunnel, a man in his 30s wearing a scout's leather armor with a 2nd-rank patch. His left shoulder was covered in blood, dried blood. His face was gray, his eyes sunken. He was walking toward B. Bronzebone via the long route because the short one through the upper tier was blocked by harpies. He saw the counter and stopped. He blinked. He looked at the price board. He looked at Daniel in his clean apron. His face had the expression of a man who wasn't sure he wasn't hallucinating. Daniel smiled. He asked which floor the man was coming from. The man said the 41st. Daniel asked if the harpies had injured him. The man said 2 had attacked him in the hallway. Daniel asked to see his shoulder. The man stepped forward and pulled down the edge of his armor. The wound was jagged but shallow. The edges were inflamed. A red streak ran from the wound to his neck, the onset of infection. The scavenger harpies fed on carrion and carried the infection on their claws. Daniel placed 3 items on the counter. A low-grade potion for 8 copper coins, a strip of clean salted cloth for a bandage for 2 copper coins, and a glass of salted water with sugar for 1 copper coin, he explained. The potion will close the wound on the outside, but the infection from the harpies is spreading inward, and a low-grade potion won't treat it. The salted cloth will draw out the pus if the bandage is changed every 6 hours. And the salted water with sugar is needed because his fingers are shaking. That means dehydration and low blood sugar after a long march without food. If he doesn't replenish himself, he'll make it to the Bronzebone but collapse at the threshold and lie there for a day. The man listened in silence. He stared at Daniel without looking away. 11 copper coins. He took out his wallet, counted out the coins, placed them on the counter, took the potion, smeared it on the wound. He took a bandage. Daniel walked around the counter and helped him bandage it because it's awkward to do it with one hand on your shoulder. The man downed the water in 1 gulp. He set the glass down. He stood silently for about 10 seconds. Then he introduced himself. Greg. He asked if Daniel would have more of that water tomorrow. Daniel said there would always be some tomorrow. Greg nodded. He said he'd bring the guys. He turned and walked toward the Bronzebone. His step was already steadier. Daniel stood behind the counter and watched him go. First sale, 11 copper coins in revenue. Cost of goods sold, 9 copper coins. Profit, 2 copper coins. He wrote the numbers on the back of the parchment, neatly, out of habit. The day was long and almost empty. After Greg, another traveler came in, an old forager who was heading down to gather mushrooms. He bought a cup of tea for 1 copper coin. He sat at the counter. He told him that down on the 40th level, they'd seen a flock of stone lizards that hadn't been there before. Daniel listened and took it all in. Stone lizards meant that the fauna on the 40th pleson, the fauna had shifted. It was a consequence of the breath. A wave of distortion was rising from below and altering ecosystems. While it was still far away on the 181st or 170th, but the consequences were already spreading. When the old man left, Daniel sat down on a rock behind the counter. He tallied up the day's results. Revenue, 12 copper coins. Expenses for 7 days of preparation, 60 copper coins for goods from Myrna and sugar. Remaining capital, 140 copper coins plus inventory. On the counter lay 22 vials of potion, 9 jars of ointment, and 38 servings of tea. A bowl of salt water cost next to nothing. He could hold out for 3 weeks without a single customer. But there would be customers. Greg said he'd bring the guys. In the world of adventurers, a scout's word was worth its weight in gold. Scouts survived on connections and information. If Greg told anyone that, at the dead end on the 38th floor there's a shop where they don't just sell you potions but explain what's wrong with you and help bandage your wound, those people will come. Not all of them, but enough. Daniel lay down on the stone floor of the niche, wrapped in his cloak, his backpack under his head, glowing moss above his head, quiet, empty, cold. He closed his eyes and thought that tomorrow he needed to make a second shelf, for ointments. Ointments can't be placed next to potions. The customer needs to see them as different categories. Potions are for emergencies. Ointments are for prevention. Different needs, different shelves, different spots on the counter. He fell asleep in the middle of that thought. Greg kept his word. On the 3rd day after the opening, he returned. Not alone. 2 others were with him. A scout named Cassie and a tracker named Tal. Both 2nd rank. Both from the 41st floor. Cassie was limping on her left leg. Tal looked fine, but moved slowly and was breathing through his mouth. Daniel looked at them from behind the counter. 3 seconds. Cassie's limp wasn't from a wound. The boot on her left foot was wet. The sole was leaking. Her foot was soaked, and her muscle had cramped up. Tal wasn't injured. He had a cold. The damp air of the 41st floor and a night spent without proper shelter. Fever. The onset of bronchitis. Daniel placed an anti-inflammatory ointment and a strip of leather for a temporary patch on the boot in front of Cassie. In front of Tal, he set down hot tea from a thermos that would bring down the fever and a glass of salt water. He explained to both of them what was happening to them. Cassie stared at him. She asked how he knew about the boot. Daniel said that the left boot was 2 shades darker than the right one. That meant it was wet. That meant it was leaking. That meant her foot was freezing. That meant her muscles were cramping. Cassie took off her boot and looked at the sole. There was a crack running the entire length. She cursed. She said that this boot had cost her 15 silver coins at the Bronze Bone. Daniel asked which craftsman she'd bought it from. Cassie gave a name. Daniel nodded. He knew that craftsman. He used cheap leather from the 35th floor that looked good, but cracked from moisture after 2 months. He told her that next time she should get boots from Master Vorn on the east side of Bronze Bone. They cost 3 silver more, but the leather is from the 28th floor. They last a year. Cassie gave him a long look. Tal drank his tea and said nothing. Greg stood to the side and smiled. When they left, Daniel recorded the takings. 24 copper coins for the 3 of them. And he noted something more important. Greg had brought 2. If each of these 3 brought 2 more, that's 9 people in a week. If each of the 9 brought in at least 1, that's 18 in 2 weeks. Word of mouth, the cheapest and most reliable marketing channel in the history of commerce. A week later, there was a line at the counter. A small one. 5 people in the morning, 3 in the evening. But for the dead end on the 38th floor, it was a miracle. Adventurers came from the 41st and 39th floors. Small groups of 2 or 3. Lone wolves, gatherers. Everyone took the long route to avoid the harpies, and everyone passed by the fork. Before, they'd walk past without stopping. Now they stopped. Daniel expanded his selection. He added dried meat he'd bought from a hunter on the 36th floor. The hunter, named Bart, hunted underground rabbits and sold the meat in bronze bone for 2 copper coins per strip. In the city, a middleman bought it for 2 and sold it for 6. Daniel offered Bart 3 copper coins per strip with a guarantee that he would take everything Bart brought. Bart agreed without hesitation. An extra copper coin per strip, with a steady volume, was more than he earned in a month.
Daniel sold the meat for 5 copper coins, a copper coin cheaper than in town, a margin of 2 copper coins per strip, less than the middleman's, but Daniel didn't have to pay rent for a stall in town. His rent was 0, a niche in the rock, free. By the end of the second week, he was making a steady daily profit of 80 copper coins. His purchase costs were about 40. Net profit, 40 copper coins a day, 280 a week, more than his annual salary in the Heroes Party. He could have stopped there, could have just traded and saved up, but Daniel was thinking ahead. He was thinking 12 months ahead, and 12 months ahead, he had a problem: safety. He was standing alone on the 38th floor, unarmed, no combat skills. As long as his customers were small-time hustlers, no one bothered him. But as soon as the shop became noticeable, as soon as the money started rolling in, the situation changed. Gangsters, looters, or just some hustler who decides it's easier to steal than to buy. He needed a security guard. By the end of the second week, she came on her own. Daniel was standing behind the counter on the evening shift. There were no customers. He was arranging meat on a new shelf he'd cobbled together from planks found in an abandoned camp. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. Someone was standing in the shadow of the tunnel, 10 paces from the counter, standing quietly. A minute, 2, 3. Daniel didn't turn around. He kept arranging the meat. He could see a silhouette, thin, in a tattered scout's cloak. The hood was pulled down. He stood and looked at the counter, more precisely, at the food. Daniel pulled a piece of hardtack from under the counter. He placed it on the edge. He set a mug of tea from the cooler next to it. He didn't say a word. He continued working. A minute passed. The shadow moved. It approached the counter. A hand in a fingerless glove took the hardtack, quickly, with a practiced motion, the motion of someone accustomed to grabbing food before it was taken away. Daniel didn't look up. He heard her eating, hastily. Then the sound stopped. She stood at the counter, holding the cracker in her hand. Half of it had been eaten. She hadn't eaten the other half. She stood there and looked. Daniel looked up. A woman, about 25 or 26 years old, a thin face, dark circles under her eyes, short red hair, a scar on her right cheekbone. A scout's cloak, but without rank insignia, torn off. That meant she had been stripped of her status. Either she had left on her own or had been expelled from the guild. At her belt was a short sword in a worn scabbard. The hilt was wrapped in a rag, but it was wrapped correctly, professionally. This sword was drawn often. She looked at him, and he saw calculation in her eyes. She was weighing her options. Take the food and leave, or take everything on the counter and leave. She could do it. Daniel could tell by her stance. Even thin and emaciated, she moved like a fighter. Center of gravity low, weight on her front leg, ready to pounce. He could have been scared, but he'd worked in retail in Los Angeles for 6 years. He'd seen people walk into a store with the intention of stealing. He'd seen their eyes. There was no theft in this woman's eyes. There was exhaustion in her eyes, so deep that she didn't care. Daniel nodded toward the mug of tea. He said quietly that it would get cold. She looked at the mug. She took it. She drank slowly. She set it down. She was silent. Then she said one sentence. She asked what she needed to do so that this wouldn't be charity. Daniel looked at her, at the sword, at the counter, at the scar, at the torn patch. He said he needed a guard. Shifts from dawn to noon and from sunset to midnight. Pay in food and 5 copper coins a day. Lodging at the shop. She was silent for about 10 seconds. Then she asked just one thing. She asked who she would be guarding. Daniel said the shop and the customers. She asked about him. Daniel said he came with the shop. She didn't smile. But something shifted in her face, like a crack in a wall through which light passes. She said her name was Evelyn Price, a former B-rank scout. Daniel didn't ask why she was a former scout. He didn't ask what had happened to her unit. He didn't ask where the scar came from. All that came later. For now, he simply showed her the corner behind the counter where a spare raincoat lay that could pass for a blanket. He said that tomorrow morning started at 6. Evelyn nodded. She lay down. A minute later, she was asleep. Daniel stood behind the counter and watched the sleeping woman in the corner of his shop. First employee. He wrote it down on his parchment. Evelyn Price. Position, guard. Wage, 5 copper coins a day plus rations. Date hired, the 14th. In the morning, she stood at the counter before he woke up. She stood straight, hands behind her back straight. A sword at her belt. She was looking down the tunnel. When the first customer arrived, a young forager with a sack of mushrooms, Evelyn followed him with her eyes from the entrance to the counter and back. The forager sensed her gaze. He straightened up. He greeted her politely. He bought some tea and left faster than usual. Daniel approached Evelyn and said one thing. He said that this man was not a threat. He was a customer. A customer should feel safe, not under surveillance. A security guard stands where they can be seen but not feared. Evelyn looked at him. She was used to guarding against people, not for them. She nodded. By lunchtime, her stance had changed. She stood a little more relaxed, a little further from the counter. Her hands weren't behind her back, but at her sides. A professional habit of adjusting quickly. By the end of the first week, 3 things had happened to Evelyn. First, customers started saying hello to her. Not because she had become friendly, she hadn't, but she nodded in response, and that was enough. Second, she killed a snake. An underground viper had slithered up to the spring at night. Evelyn chopped its head off in one swift motion. In the morning, Daniel found the carcass by the counter. Evelyn stood nearby, waiting. Daniel looked at the snake. He looked at Evelyn. He asked if it was venomous. Evelyn said yes. The venom is weak, but enough to give a person a fever for 2 days. Daniel nodded. He said that the venom of underground vipers costs 8 silver pieces a vial in the alchemy shops of Bronzebone. He asked if she knew how to extract it. Evelyn did. It was part of a scout's training. The third thing that happened took place on the 5th day. Evening. The shop was closing. Evelyn sat by the wall, sharpening her sword. Daniel was washing the counter. He did this every evening. A rag, water, wipe down every board, sweep up the crumbs, put the merchandise away. Evelyn watched him. Then she asked why he did it. She said they were just stones and boards. No one would see a dirty counter in the dark. Daniel said it wasn't for the customers, it was for him. If he stopped washing the counter every evening, in a week he'd stop checking the expiration dates on the potions. In 2 weeks, he'd stop checking the quality of the ointments. In 3, he'd start rounding up prices to his advantage. Standards aren't partial. They're either present in everything or nowhere at all. Evelyn was silent. Then she said that her former commander had said something similar thing. Only about a blade. If you don't clean your blade every day, it will fail you in battle. Daniel said the principle was the same. The first month was drawing to a close, and Daniel sat on a rock by the spring and did his calculations. It was his favorite time of day. Early morning. Evelyn was standing guard. No customers yet. Silence. He was doing his accounts on parchment. Revenue for the first month came to 2,400 copper coins. Cost of goods sold, 1,100. Evelyn's salary, 150. Other expenses, 200. Net profit, 950 copper coins. Almost 10 gold coins, in a month. That was more than he had earned in a year with the Heroes Party. But it wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. 10 gold pieces wouldn't be enough for expansion, security, or a reserve in case of a crisis. He needed to grow, and grow fast. Because the breath was rising. The old collector came every week. Every week the news was worse. The stone lizards on the 40th floor had multiplied. On the 42nd, glowing worms appeared that had previously only been seen below the 60th. On the 45th, another spring had dried up. The wave was moving upward, slowly. 1 floor every 2 weeks. This meant that in 6 months, the breath would reach the levels between the 81st and 90. And it would still take another year and a half to reach the 38th. But the consequences were arriving faster than the wave itself. The fauna was shifting. Roots were breaking down. Merchants were leaving. Mid-level adventurers got stuck between floors without supplies. And that was an opportunity. Daniel hated himself for thinking of it as an opportunity. People were dying. Infrastructure was collapsing. And he looked at it and saw a market niche. But then he remembered Greg. The trembling fingers, the infected wound. A glass of salt water that cost a penny and could save a person's life. A market niche and saving lives aren't a contradiction. They're one and the same, if done right. He needed an assortment that no one else had, and he found it in the third week, completely by accident. A customer, a third-rank adventurer named Dorn, a big guy, heavy armor. He came from the 43rd floor, bought meat and tea. Then he pulled a fist-sized piece of metal out of his bag and placed it on the counter. Asked if Daniel knew what it was. Daniel picked it up. Heavy, dark blue, with tiny sparks inside. He had seen this metal once before, on the 55th floor. A blacksmith in the city showed him samples and quoted prices. It was deep cobalt, a rare metal. On the surface, they paid 50 gold pieces for a piece like this. In the underworld, the price fluctuated but never dropped below 30. Daniel told Dorn that it was deep cobalt. Dorn nodded. He said he'd found it on the 43rd. He said that in Bronzebone, he'd been offered 12 gold pieces. He asked if Daniel could give him more. Daniel looked at the metal. He looked at Dorn. 12 gold pieces was a ripoff. The middleman in Bronzebone knew the real price and was offering a quarter of it because the adventurer didn't know and couldn't verify it. Classic information asymmetry. The seller knows the price, but the buyer doesn't. Daniel could have done the same thing. Buy it for 15 and sell it for 30. A 100% margin. But he did something else. He told Dorn the truth. He said that this piece was worth between 30 and 50 gold pieces, depending on its purity, that he himself couldn't pay that much. But he could help find a buyer for a 10% commission. Dorn stared at him. He was silent. Then he asked why Daniel was telling him this. He could have just bought it on the cheap. Daniel replied that he could. Once, but then Dorn would find out the truth and never come back. And he'd tell 10 of his friends that there was a con artist at the 38th Street Junction. 10 lost customers were worth more than a single deal. Dorn looked at him for another 5 seconds. Then he said one word. Deal. That's how a new business emerged. Commission-based trading. Daniel became a middleman. Adventurers brought him rare finds. He appraised them. He found a buyer through his growing network of contacts. He took 10%. Honestly, transparently. The seller knew how much it sold for. The buyer knew how much it cost. The commission was out in the open. No hidden markups. This was so unusual for the underworld that the first clients didn't believe it. They checked. They asked others. And they were convinced. 2 weeks later, people started bringing him more than just cobalt. Crystals, hides, rare herbs, alchemical ingredients. He didn't buy anything himself. He just brought people together. Just did the math. Just guaranteed a fair price. His counter became a marketplace. A small, makeshift marketplace on a stone table in the middle of an abandoned tunnel. But it worked. By the end of the second month, the revenue from location number 1 was 300 copper coins a day. Commissions brought in just as much. Daniel hired a second worker, a 17-year-old boy named Pete, an orphan from the Bronze Bone. He used to run errands for the middlemen in exchange for food. Daniel took him on as a courier. Pete carried messages between the shop and the suppliers. He ran to Myrna for ointment. He ran to Bart for meat. He ran to Bronzebone with orders for goods that weren't in stock. Pay was 8 copper coins a day, plus food and lodging at the shop. Pete worked like a man possessed, because for the first time in his life, someone was paying him money instead of handouts. In the 6th week, a problem arose. Daniel had been expecting it. He knew it would come. He just didn't know in what form. It came in the form of 3 men. Late evening, the shop was closed. Daniel was washing the counter. Evelyn was standing at the entrance. Pete was sleeping in the corner. 3 men emerged from the tunnel. Heavy leather armor, no insignia, no guild marks. The leader had an axe slung over his shoulder. The 2 behind him carried short swords. The leader stopped 3 steps from the counter. He looked at the merchandise, at Daniel, at Evelyn. He smiled, broadly. He said they'd heard about the new shop at the fork in the road. He said it was a good spot. He said that in such good spots there are problems. Monsters wander in, bandits pass through, all sorts of things happen. He said they could provide security, for a modest fee. 50 copper coins a day. Daniel listened, standing behind the counter with a wet rag in his hand. He looked at the leader. He did the math. 50 dimes a day is 1,500 a month, half his net profit. Classic protection racket. He'd seen it in Los Angeles. Small shops in certain neighborhoods paid for so-called protection. Those who didn't pay got burned. Daniel knew 3 ways to deal with this. First, pay up. Second, refuse and brace for the consequences. Third, make it so that paying wasn't profitable for them. He chose the third option. He looked at the host, calmly, no fear. Fear was there too, but Daniel had learned to hide it behind the counter. 6 years of practice. He said the offer was interesting, but he had a counter-proposal. He said his shop was the only place between the 36th and 40th floors where gear can be repaired. In a month, there would be potions, food, repairs, and loot appraisal here. If they shut it down, the 30 adventurers who pass through this junction every day would be left without supplies. 30 adventurers who know them by sight. 30 adventurers, among whom are third-rank fighters. The host stopped smiling. Daniel continued. He said there was another option. He was willing to buy their trophies at a fair price. If they hunt harpies up there, the feathers of scavenger harpies are worth 5 silver per bundle in alchemy shops. Claws are worth 3. He could buy them for 4 and 2, respectively, consistently, every week. The host stood there thinking. It was clear from his face. He'd come for easy money, and he received a business proposal. The two behind him exchanged glances. One asked the host in a low voice if the feathers really were worth that much. The host didn't answer. He didn't know. Because he was a thug, not a merchant. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Evelyn, who was standing at the entrance with her hand on her sword. Quiet, calm, but his hand was on his sword. Then he said he'd think about it. He turned around. He left. The two followed him. When the footsteps faded, Daniel exhaled. His hands were shaking. The rag he was holding was wet with sweat, not water. Evelyn approached. She looked at his hands. She said he'd been bluffing. Daniel said, not exactly. The feathers really were worth that much. And 30 customers was true. But he said that if they hadn't left, then yes, he had been bluffing. Evelyn nodded. She was silent. Then she said they would come back. But not for the money, for the feathers. Because 4 silver coins per bundle was more than they made from robbery. Daniel looked at her. For the first time in 3 weeks, she had said more than 2 sentences in a row. She was right. 4 days later, the leader returned. Alone, without an axe, with a sack of feathers, 6 bundles. Daniel paid 24 silver coins. The leader counted them, nodded, left. A week later, he came back, with claws. The former racketeer had become a supplier. Daniel wrote this down on his parchment, not because he was proud, but because it was a lesson. Every person in the dungeon survives as best they can. If you show them a way to survive that brings in more and costs less effort, they'll switch over. Not out of morality, out of economics. Morality is a luxury. Economics is oxygen. By the 8th week, the shop looked different. The stone counter had grown wider. Daniel had expanded it using planks and stones. A second shelf had appeared, and a third. 3 boards hung on the wall. The first listed prices for popular items. The second showed current purchase prices for trophies. The third displayed the delivery schedule. When the meat would arrive. When the ointment would be in stock. When a shipment of potions from Bronzebone was expected. The third board was a revolution. No merchant in the dungeon posted a schedule. A customer would come in and hope the item they needed was available. If not, they'd come back tomorrow, or go to someone else. Daniel gave them certainty. He found her on the lower level of the 38th floor, or rather, she found him. Pete brought the news. He said a half-breed lived in the abandoned tunnels south of the fork. A stone-skinned, a blacksmith. She repairs cauldrons in exchange for food for those who wander in. Few people go there. They're afraid of the stone-skinned. Daniel knew about the stone-skinned. A mountain race, natural-born blacksmiths. Skin on their hands and shoulders with gray stone veins. In the clan forges, they forged the best weapons on the continent. They were paid hundreds of gold pieces for their work. But clan society was closed, strict rules, a rigid hierarchy. Half-bloods were at the very bottom. Only purebloods had the right to forge. Half-bloods were allowed to bring coal and remove slag. Daniel went to see her the next morning. He left Evelyn in charge. He walked for 20 minutes through a narrow tunnel, then through a wide cavern with a low ceiling, then through a narrow passageway that smelled of burnt stone and metal. That was a good sign. It meant the forge was somewhere nearby, or something like a forge. He emerged into a small cave. The ceiling was low. In the center was a hearth made of stones. Debris from tools lay nearby. Rusty pliers, a bent hammer, a set of files with broken handles. A cauldron stood on a stone by the wall, repaired. A fresh patch gleamed on its side. The work was clean, smooth, professional. The patch fit like a glove. Daniel looked at the patch and realized he was looking at a master, not an apprentice, not an amateur. A master who repairs other people's cauldrons for food because she has nowhere else to go. She was sitting by the far wall, young, 22 or 23 years old. Not very tall, skinny. Her hands were large for her height. On her forearms and shoulders were gray streaks of leathery skin. Her hair was dark, short, and unevenly cut. Her eyes were hazel with gray flecks. She looked at him warily, not hostile, just wary. Like an animal that's used to people bringing nothing good but hasn't decided to run yet. Daniel stopped at the entrance. He didn't come any closer. He looked at the boiler. He said the patch was good. He said the seam was even and airtight, and that a craftsman who could repair boilers like that could fix anything. She was silent. He introduced himself. He said he ran a shop at the fork in the road and that he needed a blacksmith. She was still silent. Then she asked what for. For weapons. Daniel shook his head. He said he didn't need weapons. He said he needed shelves, hinges, locks, counters, bread knives, hooks for cloaks, door handles, fasteners for boards, 100 little things that make up a shop. She looked at him. She didn't understand. Every blacksmith in Aerdall forged weapons or armor. It was the only thing that brought in money. Swords, shields, spearheads, armor repairs. Civilian goods were considered menial work, below one's dignity. She repeated slowly. Shelves, hinges, locks. Daniel nodded. He laid out the terms. Pay of 15 copper coins a day plus room and board. A workshop attached to the shop. Materials at his expense. Everything she made belonged to the chain, but her name would be on every piece. The last part was an improvisation. He'd added it at the last moment because he'd seen the way she looked at the cauldron. With the expression an artist has when looking at their work, with hunger, not for food, for recognition. She was silent for a long time, a minute, 2. Then she asked his name. Daniel. She said her name was Sora Zhang. Then she asked one more thing. She asked if it was true that she wouldn't have to forge blades. Daniel said it was true. She stood up, gathered her tools. 4 movements, pliers, a hammer, files, and a coil of wire. Everything she had. She followed him, didn't ask anything else. He led her to a fork in the road. Evelyn looked at her. Sora looked at Evelyn. 2 broken women who didn't know each other and had no reason to trust one another. Evelyn nodded. Sora nodded. That was enough. Daniel showed her a corner behind the bench where she could set up a forge. Sora surveyed the spot. Stone, airflow, natural draft through a crack in the ceiling. An hour later, she had built the hearth. Simple, effective. The stones fit tightly together. The draft was steady. By evening, she was already working. The first order was from Daniel. 3 hinges for a cabinet, a hook for a lantern, 2 brackets for a shelf. She made them in 2 hours. Daniel looked at the hinges. They were perfect. Not just functional, beautiful. With a slight curve at the end. With a texture that made them pleasant to the touch. She couldn't make anything ugly. It was physically impossible for her. Even the hinges for the cabinet she made as a work of art. He hung the hinges, opened the cabinet, closed it. The hinges moved silently, smoothly, like a Swiss mechanism in a world where doors creaked by default. Daniel told her the hinges were good. She stood by the kiln, holding a hammer. Her hands were covered in soot. Her face was calm, but her eyes were shining. He thought she was about to cry. She didn't cry. She just stood there holding the hammer. The next day she made a new countertop, without an order, all by herself. She got up at dawn and started working. By noon, where the crooked stone table had stood, there was a counter made of stone slabs held together by metal brackets. Even, smooth, with a built-in shelf underneath for storage, with a rim around the edge so coins wouldn't roll off, with hooks on the sides for bags. Daniel stood in front of the counter and watched. Then he looked at Sora. She stood nearby, waiting for his assessment, waiting for words, waiting as one waits for a verdict. He said one sentence. He said it was the best counter he'd seen in 2 worlds. Sora turned away. She walked over to the mountain. On the 3rd day, Daniel heard a sound in the night, quiet, muffled. Sora was sitting by the wall behind the stove, hugging her knees and crying, silently. Only her shoulders were shaking. Daniel didn't go over, didn't ask what had happened. He knew what had happened. Nothing had happened. It was just that, for the first time in her life, she was doing what she wanted to do. And someone had told her that it was good. Sometimes that's enough to break the dam a person has been building for years. In the morning, she worked as usual. She didn't talk about the night. Daniel didn't mention it. Some things exist only in the dark and need no words. By the end of the first week with Sora, the shop had changed. Not in merchandise, in form. The counter was better, the shelves were better. The hooks for the lanterns cast light evenly on the merchandise. The display case that Sora had assembled from stone slabs and thin metal frames allowed the merchandise to be seen but not touched. Daniel placed Myrna's ointment and a rare crystal that an adventurer from the 43rd had left on consignment. The display case worked like a magnet. Customers approached. They looked. They asked questions. They bought. Visual merchandising. The first display case in the history of the dungeon. But the main change was something else. Sora began repairing customers' equipment. It started by accident. An adventurer named Kel came in for some meat and complained that the buckle on his breastplate had cracked. At the bronze bone, they charged 8 silver for repairs. 8 silver for a buckle. Sora heard him. She walked over. She looked. She said it would take 10 minutes. She took the breastplate. 10 minutes later, the buckle was as good as new. Daniel set the price at 3 silver. Kel paid without haggling. Because 3 silver instead of 8, and done right there instead of a trip to town and back. That wasn't an offer, it was a gift. In the first week, Sora repaired 14 pieces of equipment. The income from repairs totaled 42 silver. That was more than the shop's entire retail income for the same period. Daniel looked at the numbers and thought, repairs, that was the next level. Not just selling goods, selling a service. A customer comes in with a problem and leaves with a solution. A potion is a product, a bandage is a service, meat is a product, repairing a sword is a service. Anyone can have a product. A service is what keeps customers coming back. In the third week, Myrna came in with Sora. The herbalist didn't come with any goods. She came to look around. Daniel had already ordered 30 vials of ointment a week and had paid on time every time. She wanted to see where her ointment was going. She saw the display case. She saw her ointment behind the glass. She saw the sign next to the jar. Ointment for burns. Prepared by Master Myrna. Herbs from the 38th floor. She stood in front of the display case for a minute. Then she turned to Daniel. She asked what the sign was about. Daniel said it was information for the customer. The customer should know who made the product and what it's made of. That's trust. Myrna stood there looking at the sign with her name on it. She'd been selling ointments for 20 years. No one had ever put her name next to the product. She was invisible. The hands that made the thing, not the name, not a person. Hands. She didn't say anything. She left. 2 days later, she brought in a batch of ointment, 20 jars instead of 10. The quality was higher, noticeably higher. Daniel opened one. The consistency was thicker. The scent was cleaner. The color was more even. Myrna had been making this ointment for 20 years, and for the first time in 20 years, she had put in the effort. Because for the first time, her name was on the display. The end of the second month. The shop at the fork on the 38th floor had ceased to be a shop. It had become a station, a place where you could buy food, to repair gear, to get a fair appraisal of trophies, to drink tea, to find out the delivery schedule, to see a display case with rare goods, and most importantly, to be seen. Daniel knew every regular customer by name. He knew which floor everyone came from. He knew who was injured. He knew whose birthday was coming up in a week. He knew who had lost a partner last month and was drinking more than usual. He greeted them, asked how they were doing, poured tea for those who just stopped by to look around. He never rushed them, never pressured them. It wasn't a strategy, it was a habit. At Handmart, he did the same thing. He knew the grandmother who came every morning for bread. He knew the student who bought ramen on sale. He knew the mom with twins who always forgot the milk and came back 10 minutes later. He remembered people, not because it helped sales, because they were people. Here in the dungeon, where people were seen as functions, that was something new. One evening, Evelyn asked him. They were sitting by the extinguished hearth. Sora had gone to bed. Pete had left with the morning caravan for Bronzebone to get herbs. It was quiet. Evelyn asked why he remembered names. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he said that when a person hears their name from someone who isn't obligated to remember it, it changes something inside. Not immediately, not dramatically, but it changes things. A person starts to think they aren't invisible, that they've been noticed, that they exist not just as a wallet full of money. And that person comes back. Not for the goods, for the feeling. And then they buy the goods because they've already come. Evelyn was silent. Then she said it sounded like manipulation. Daniel nodded. He said the line was thin. that he himself wasn't always sure which side he was on. But he said the difference between manipulation and care lay in one thing. A manipulator remembers a name to make a sale. He remembers the name and then makes the sale. The order matters. Evelyn thought about that. Then she said it was the strangest thing she'd ever heard from a merchant. Daniel had his shoulders. He said he was a strange salesman. She almost smiled. Almost. Shadows from the horn moved across the walls. The moss on the ceiling shimmered green. Somewhere far below, deep in the dungeon, a wave of breath rose one floor, slowly, unrelentingly. But here on the 38th floor, a small shop light burned. The third month began with rain. On the 38th floor, there was no rain in the usual sense, but condensation from the vault accumulated and fell in heavy drops. The walls were getting wet. The tunnels were getting slippery. Adventurers came to the shop wet and angry. Daniel stood behind the counter and watched. A man came in from the tunnel, wet. The first thing he wanted wasn't a potion or meat. He wanted to warm up. Daniel turned to Sora. He asked if she could make a brazier, a small one, with a grate, to put by the entrance. Sora finished it in half a day. A stone base, a metal grate, a vent through a crack in the wall. Daniel lit the coals. He placed the brazier by the entrance to the niche. He placed a piece of wood nearby with a sign written in charcoal. Free heating. The first customer who came in from the wet tunnel and saw the brazier stopped. He stood and watched. Then he approached. He held his hands out toward the warmth. He stood there for a minute. 2. He warmed up. Then he turned to the counter and bought meat and tea for 7 copper coins. The brazier cost Daniel 5 copper coins a day for coal. It brought in an additional 40 kopecks in revenue. People came to warm up. They stayed and bought things. It was the same principle as free samples in a supermarket. Give a person something for free and they'll feel obligated. Not because you forced them to, because that's how human nature works. But Daniel wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the door. The heat from the brazier was escaping into the tunnel. The efficiency was 30%. He needed a door. Or at least a vestibule. A double door with an air gap between them. The simplest principle of thermal insulation. Every store in Seoul had a vestibule like that. Here it was an unknown technology. He explained the idea to Sora. Sora listened. Then she nodded. 3 days later, 2 frames covered with the skins of underground rabbits stood at the entrance to the alcove. A step and a half between the frames. You enter through the first door. It closes behind you. You open the second one. You enter the shop. The heat doesn't escape. The simplest vestibule. The temperature inside the shop rose by a few degrees. Customers came in and relaxed. They took off their gloves. They unbuttoned their coats. They stayed longer. The average check went up by a third. But the main thing wasn't the money. The main thing was that the shop had become a place, not a stop on the route, a place. A place you go into because it's warm and dry inside and someone knows your name. In the second week of the third month, an event occurred that Daniel hadn't planned for. A squad came to the shop. Not a small group of 2 or 3 scouts. A full-fledged squad of 6 men, 4th rank, heavy armor, good weapons, guild insignia. They were heading down to the 45th floor on a mission to clear the cave of stone wolves. They stopped at the shop because they'd heard from someone that here they could buy equipment quickly and cheaply. The squad leader was a man in his 40s named Horst, graying temples, a scar across his left eyebrow, calm, businesslike. He looked around the shop. He looked at the display case, at the price board, at the delivery schedule, at the vestibule, at the brazier. He turned to Daniel and said that in 20 years in the dungeon, he hadn't seen anything like it. Daniel nodded and asked what they needed. Horst listed it off. Mid-grade potions, repairs for 2 breastplates, sharpening for 4 swords, provisions for 5 days, rope, torches, a map of the 45th floor, if available. Daniel listened. He took notes. He calculated. He didn't have any mid-grade potions. He only had low-grade ones. But he knew where to get mid-grade ones. An alchemist named Olga at the Bronze Bone had some in stock. Pete could run and get them in half a day. Sora would repair the breastplates in 3 hours. Sora would sharpen the swords, too. Provisions were available. There was rope. Torches could be made from the resin of the underground pines on the 37th floor, and sticks. He had a map of the 45th floor. He'd drawn it himself, based on what clients had told him over the past 2 months. It wasn't complete, but it was better than nothing. Daniel looked at Horst. He said he could provide everything except medium-grade potions. The potions would be ready in 6 hours, if the squad was willing to wait. Horst asked how much. Daniel did the math. He laid out the estimate on parchment, item by item, with prices, with the total. Horst took the parchment. He read it. His expression changed. He was used to merchants who quoted a price out loud and haggled for half an hour. Here, everything was written down. Every item. Every price. The total amount. There was no tax because it didn't exist in the underworld, but the principle of transparency was the same. Horst looked at the total. 4 gold, 30 silver. He looked at Daniel. He said that at the bronze bone, they would have asked for 7 gold for the same thing. Daniel said that at the bronze bone, they pay for rent, for middlemen, and for the guild fee. He doesn't have those expenses. That's why the price is lower. Horst nodded. He took out his purse. He paid. The group settled down by the brazier. Sora took the breastplates and went to the forge. Pete ran to the bronze bone for potions. Daniel gathered the provisions. He sliced the meat, packed it in portions. Each portion was for 1 person for 1 day. 5 days for 6 people, 30 portions. Each was labeled. Day 1, lunch. Day 2, breakfast, and so on. Horst watched this. He walked over. He asked why he was labeling them. Daniel explained. If the portions are labeled, no one will eat someone else's. There won't be any arguments. There won't be a situation where on the 5th day someone is hungry and someone isn't. This is supply discipline. It saves squads just as well as a good sword. Horst stood and listened. Then he quietly said that in 20 years, no one had ever marked his provisions. Daniel shrugged. He said it was standard procedure. 6 hours later, the squad left. Equipment repaired, swords sharpened, provisions packed, potions obtained. The map of the 45th of the 45th floor was copied onto parchment. Before leaving, Horst stopped at the counter. He said that when he returned from the mission, he would stop by again, and that he would tell the others. Daniel nodded. The others. That was the key word. Horst's squad was 4th rank. These weren't lone scouts. These were professionals. With money, with contacts, with a reputation. One such squad was worth 50 small clients. And if Horst told others like him, in a month a new class of clientele would appear at the shop. A major one. Solvency. Loyalty. Daniel jotted it down on parchment. Category A clients. He made a note. Such clients require a separate level of service. Pre-order. Preparing the kit in advance. Customized selection. Volume discount. Everything that Handmart called corporate service. By the end of the 3rd month, Daniel tallied the results. Monthly revenue amounted to 12 gold pieces. Net profit after all expenses, 5 gold pieces. 500 silver pieces. From scratch in 3 months. But money wasn't the main result. The main thing was something else. People knew him. At the fork on the 38th floor stood a shop everyone was talking about. Adventurers passed the word among themselves. There's a place at the fork by the bronze bone. Fair prices there. They repair gear there. They know your name there. Someone started calling him the merchant from the fork. Someone else kept it simpler. That guy in the apron. He didn't like any of those nicknames, but that was normal. Nicknames aren't chosen by the owners. They're chosen by the market. One evening, after the shop had closed and Sora had gone to bed and Pete had gone to Myrna for his morning dose of ointment, Daniel sat by the brazier drinking tea. Evelyn sat next to him. She was cleaning her sword, silently, as usual. Then she said something. She said that on the 39th floor, south of the main route, there was an abandoned outpost. A stone building. The roof was intact, 2 stories. It used to be a silver anchor trading post. It closed 6 months ago when the route stopped being profitable. The building is empty. Daniel set down his mug. He looked at her. He asked why she was telling him this. Evelyn said he was outgrowing this space. The counter is full. The shop is cramped. The storage is just bags on the floor. He needs more space. Daniel thought. The 39th floor. Closer to the lower routes. Closer to the 41st, where his main clientele came from. A stone building with a roof. 2 floors. Free if no one else claims it. He could move the shop. Or he could open a second location, without closing the first one. 2 shops, one at the fork, the second on the 39th, each serving its own flow of customers. A courier service between them via Pete. Shared suppliers. A shared warehouse. A unified pricing policy. A network. The word popped into his head on its own, like when the word shopkeeper. But he knew this word. He'd known it for 6 years. Retail chain, franchise, scaling. He looked at Evelyn, told her she needed to show him that building tomorrow. Evelyn nodded, finished her tea, went back to her post. Daniel sat by the brazier. The coals were smoldering. The moss on the ceiling shimmered. Somewhere below, deep in the underground, the breath was rising. It was far away, but it was rising. And between it and the surface were thousands of people who needed food and potions and repairs and warmth, and someone who knew them by name. Daniel took out a parchment. He wrote, "Point number 2, floor 39, opening in 1 month." And below, Handmart Underground Network. He looked at the name, written for the first time, crooked, in charcoal, on crumpled parchment, but written. The building on the 39th floor was better than Daniel expected and worse than he had hoped. Better because the walls were stone, sturdy, 2 floors with 3-meter-high ceilings, a roof made of stone slabs laid on beams. There were no windows because windows underground are pointless, but there were ventilation shafts, 4 of them. The draft worked. The air was fresh. On the first floor, 1 large room and 2 small ones, a trading hall and 2 storage rooms. On the second floor, 3 rooms, an office and 2 living quarters. The former trading post of the Silver Anchor. Built to last. Made worse by the fact that the inside was a wreck. When the Silver Anchor left, they took everything of value and destroyed everything they couldn't take. The counters were smashed. The shelves were torn down. The doors were broken down. The anchor's emblem remained burned into the wall. An anchor inside a shield. An inscription beneath the emblem. Property of the Silver Anchor Guild. No trespassing. Daniel stood in the center of the devastated hall and took stock. Repairs would require materials. Materials cost money. He had 5 gold pieces in net profit from 3 months. Minus the funds set aside for purchasing goods for location number 1. Minus salaries. He had about 2 gold coins left. With this money, he had to restore the building and stock the second location with goods. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But enough if he approached it the right way. He turned to Sora. She was standing by the wall, running her fingers over the stonework. Her fingers, streaked with gray, glided over the stone. She read him like a book. She said the masonry was sound, the mortar was strong, the walls would stand for another 100 years. The problem was only inside. Everything made of wood and metal needed to be replaced. Daniel asked how long it would take. Sora thought for a moment. She said that if he gave her iron and wood, she could build a counter in 2 days, shelves in 3, doors in 2, hinges, locks, and hooks another day. 10 days total if working from dawn to dusk. Daniel nodded. 10 days for repairs, plus a week to buy inventory and set up deliveries. 3 weeks until opening. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was standing at the entrance, looking outside. The tunnel was wider than at the fork. The route ran 100 paces to the north. Traffic was light but steady. Adventurers were heading to the 40th level and below. They were coming back. They were passing by. They used to go into the Silver Anchor outpost. Now they were passing by because the outpost was closed. If they opened it again, they'd go in. Evelyn said it was a good spot. But she said one more thing. She said the anchor emblem on the wall was a problem. The Silver Anchor considered this building theirs. They'd left but hadn't given up ownership. If Daniel took over the building, the anchor would find out. And they would come. Daniel looked at the emblem. A burnt anchor inside a shield. Beautifully made. High quality. Made to last forever, he thought. In his past world, there had been situations like this too. Empty premises. Formal owners who didn't use them but wouldn't give them up either. Squatting. A legal gray area. There was no legal system here in the usual sense. There were guild laws. And guild power. The Silver Anchor could send people. Swords. Pressure. He could do 2 things. First, occupy the building quietly and hope the anchor wouldn't find out. That was foolish. They'd find out within a month. Second, occupy the building openly and make it more expensive to evict him than to put up with him. He chose the second option, because it was the only tool he possessed. Economics. Make it so that every decision against him cost more than a decision in his favor. He returned to the fork in the road, sat down at the counter, wrote 3 letters. The first to Horst, the 4th-rank squad commander who had promised to return. He wrote that he was opening a second location on the 39th floor, that there would be pre-orders and a 10% discount on gear for regular squads, that Horst and his squad were invited to the opening. The second letter was to Bart the hunter. He wrote that he was doubling the meat purchase, that he was willing to pay 4 copper coins per strip instead of 3, on the condition that Bart supplies both locations. The third letter was written to Greg, the scout who was his first customer. By this time, Greg had become something of an unofficial ambassador for the shop. He told everyone he met about it. Not for money, just because he thought it was the right thing to do. Daniel wrote him a request. to spread the word among his friends that a second location would be opening on the 39th floor in 3 weeks, with the same prices, with the same service, with renovations. Pete delivered the letters in 2 days. The replies came in 3. Horst wrote that he'd be there. Bart wrote that he agreed. Greg didn't write anything. He just started telling people. Within a week, everyone from the 36th to the 42nd floor knew about the second location. The renovation was on schedule. Sora was working. Daniel helped out. He hauled stones. He mixed mortar. He handed tools. His body protested. His muscles ached. His back throbbed. The calluses on his hands would burst and grow back. But he worked. Because there was no money to hire workers and waiting was not an option, Evelyn was torn between the sites, in the morning at the fork, in the evening on the 39th. She didn't complain, but Daniel could see she was getting tired. He could tell by the way she held her sword by evening, a little lower than usual, a little slower to draw it from its sheath. He needed a second guard. There was no money for a second guard. He jotted it down on his list of problems. Problem number 1, security at the second location. Problem number 2, staff. Who would stand behind the counter at 39th while he was at the fork in the road? Pete wasn't cut out for it. Pete was a courier, a good kid, fast, honest. But behind the counter, he needed someone who knew how to talk to customers, someone who could see what a person needed, someone who could read the room. Daniel needed 2 copies of himself. That resource didn't exist, so he had to train someone. He started training Pete. Every evening after closing, they'd sit by the brazier. Daniel would explain how to tell which floor a customer came from by the condition of their boots, how to tell if they were hungry or injured by the way they moves, how to offer a set rather than a single item, how to state the price so it sounded like information rather than a demand. Pete listened, memorized, tried. He made mistakes. He offered an adventurer with a burn some bruise ointment. He mixed up the price of a potion and sold it for 6 copper coins instead of 8. He forgot a regular customer's name. Daniel didn't scold him. He corrected him. He explained why. Pete did a great job. He was learning because he wanted to, not because he was forced to. After 2 weeks, Pete could stand behind the counter on his own. Not as well as Daniel, but acceptably. He knew the inventory. He knew the prices. He knew the 10 most common customer problems and what to recommend for each. That was enough. On the 18th day, the renovation was finished. Sora had done the impossible. The sales floor on the first floor looked better than when it belonged to the Silver Anchor. A polished stone counter, shelves on the walls with metal brackets, a display case by the entrance, a brazier in the center of the room, a vestibule at the entrance, a price board, a schedule board, a board with purchase prices for trophies. On the second floor, Sora set up a workshop, a forge, a workbench. Tools hung on the wall in order of size, clean, organized. Next to the workshop were 2 living quarters, one for the staff, the second was still empty. Daniel didn't take down the Silver Anchor emblem. He left it up. He hung his own sign next to it, a dark stone board. The letters were carved out and filled with white clay. Hanmart Underground, location number 2. Under the sign, Sora carved a small hammer, her signature. Daniel looked at the sign. He looked at the hammer. He nodded. He scheduled the opening for the next day, 3 o'clock. Evelyn stood at the entrance. Sora was at the forge. Pete was behind the counter. Daniel stood in the center of the hall. He waited. The first customer arrived an hour later. Not an adventurer. An old woman forager with a bag of mushrooms. She came in to warm up. She saw the display case. She saw the prices on the board. She bought some tea. She sat by the brazier. She left. The second customer arrived 2 hours later. A third-rank scout. He asked if it was true that they repaired gear here. Sora took his gauntlets, fixed them in 20 minutes. 2 silver. 3rd, 4th, 5th. By evening, 11 people had passed through point number 2. The takings amounted to 48 copper coins. Not much. But for the first day in a new place, it was normal. Daniel stood behind the counter and watched the hall empty out. 2 locations, 2 shops. One at the fork in the road, the second on 39th. A 20-minute walk between them. Shared suppliers, shared warehouse, uniform prices, one brand, a network. Small, shaky, consisting of 3.5 people and a delivery boy, but a chain. The response came 2 weeks later. Daniel had expected it sooner. 2 weeks meant the information was making its way up the chain. From the small traders of Bronzebone to the agents of Silver Anchor, from the agents to the regional operations managers, from the managers up, to someone who made the decisions. 2 people arrived, not thugs, worse, Officials. A man in a clean doublet with a silver anchor-shaped pin on his lapel. A woman with a folder of documents under her arm. Both calm, polite, professional. The man introduced himself, said his name was Rogar and that he was a representative of the Silver Anchor Guild's legal department. The woman remained silent and took notes. Rogar surveyed the room. He looked at the sign. He looked at the anchor emblem that Daniel had left on the wall. He looked at Daniel, smiled, said that the building was the property of the Silver Anchor Guild, that Daniel had occupied it without permission, that this was a violation of the Guild's charter, that he had the right to demand immediate eviction and compensation for its use. Daniel listened. He stood behind the counter, in a clean apron, calm. Inside, he wasn't calm. Inside, there was cold. That same cold he felt when, in Los Angeles at Handmart, when municipal inspectors came and started talking about violations that didn't exist. Coldness and clarity. He asked Rogar 3 questions. The first, is Anchor's ownership of this building registered in the Bronze Bones City Port Registry? Rogar said the building was constructed by the Guild and that was sufficient. Daniel said he hadn't asked who built it. He asked if it was registered. In Bronzebone, as in most port cities, there was a property registry. Simple. Whoever is listed owns it. The Silver Anchor built outposts everywhere but didn't register them all, because registration cost a 50 gold fee and the Anchor skimped on minor locations. Daniel knew this because a year ago he had looked through the Bronzebone registry while keeping records for the hero's party. This post wasn't listed in the registry. Rogar was silent for a second. The woman stopped writing. Second question. Daniel asked how long the building had stood empty and unused. According to Dungeon Customs, if a trading post stood empty for more than 3 months without security and without an application for renewal, anyone could occupy it as abandoned property. It wasn't a law, it was a custom. But customs in the underworld were worth more than laws because laws were written by the guilds, while customs were upheld by everyone else. The building had been vacant for 6 months. Rogar knew this, and he knew that Daniel knew. Third question. Daniel asked if the Silver Anchor Guild wanted the adventurers on the 38th and 39th floors find out that the Anchor had kicked out the only shop serving that area, the very area the Anchor itself had abandoned 6 months ago. Adventurers who pass through that area and who vote with their feet and their wallets. It wasn't a question. It was a threat. A gentle one, a polite one, with a smile, but a threat nonetheless. Rogar looked at him. The professional gaze of a man accustomed to exerting pressure who, for the first time, had run into a wall in the form of a counter. The woman with the folder began taking notes again. Rogar said he would pass the information on to management, that while the building's status was under review, Daniel could continue use it. He said it as if it were a favor. Daniel nodded. He thanked him. He offered tea. Rogar declined. He left. The woman followed him. When they were gone, Daniel sat down in a chair and sat there for 5 minutes without moving. Evelyn stood at the entrance. She was silent. Then she said he'd won the round. Daniel shook his head. He said he hadn't won. He said he'd bought some time. The Anchor would return. With different arguments. Or without arguments. Just with swords. He needed to strengthen his position before that happened. Strengthen meant one thing. More customers. More allies. More people who needed his shop so much that they would stand up for it. For the next 2 weeks, he worked on that. He expanded the selection at location number 2. He added mid-grade potions. He arranged with the alchemist Olga in Bronze Bone for regular deliveries. Olga refused at first. She had a contract with the Silver Anchor, an exclusive one. But Daniel found out that the Anchor was holding her payment back for a month, regularly, every time. Olga was working on credit and hated it. Daniel offered to pay in advance, in full, a week in advance. Olga looked at him. She asked what if Anchor found out. Daniel said that Anchor would definitely find out, and that when they did, Olga would have a choice. A supplier who pays in advance, or a supplier who delays payment by a month. He wasn't making the decision for Olga, she was. Olga thought about it for 2 days. Then she started supplying. Toward the end of the 4th month, another event occurred. She came up from the lower floors, exhausted, in a dirty robe, barefoot, with chapped lips and burns from the sun moss on her hands. Sun moss grew on the 43rd floor and glowed so brightly that it burned the skin upon prolonged contact. So she had been walking from below, for a long time. She reached the entrance to point number 2 and fell. She just fell. Her legs buckled and she lay down on the stone at the threshold. Evelyn caught her, dragged her inside. She laid her down by the brazier. Daniel looked at her. A cassock. White fabric. Dirty, but once white, on her chest, where a symbol had been sewn on. The symbol was torn off, roughly, as if it had been ripped off by hand. The Order of the Bright Hand, a priestess, a former one, defrocked. He'd seen others like her. In the dungeon, the priests of the Bright Hand healed for money and for an oath. A good healer was worth as much as a good fighter. The orders traded healing as a commodity. And like any commodity, it was subject to the rules of a monopoly. Only those granted the right by the order could heal. The rest were heretics. Daniel didn't know why this woman had been expelled. He didn't ask. He did what he always did. He fed her. The first thing he did was give her water, then bread, then hot soup. She ate slowly. Her hands were shaking. Daniel sat beside her and said nothing. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He just sat there. When she finished eating, she looked up. Dark, deep, with a weariness that didn't come from the road, from life.
She said her name was Yuna So. Daniel told her his name. She fell asleep a minute later, right by the brazier. She slept for 12 hours. Daniel covered her with his cloak. Evelyn stood nearby and watched. Then she quietly asked Daniel how many more broken people he planned to pick up. Daniel said as many as he could find. Evelyn shook her head, but there was something resembling understanding on her face. When Yuna woke up, Daniel didn't ask about her past. He asked only one thing. He asked what she could do. Yuna said she could heal. Daniel nodded. He asked if she wanted to heal. Yuna was silent. Then she said she did, but she said she had no right to. The order had revoked her license. Without a license, healing is considered illegal under guild rules. Daniel asked whose rules? Yuna said the rules of the Order of the Bright Hand, which are recognized by all major guilds. Daniel nodded. Then he said one thing. He said that his shop wasn't a member of any guild,
That it stood on unclaimed territory. That the order's rules applied in waystation cities and on the surface. Here on the 39th floor, in an abandoned trading post, no one's rules applied except those he set himself. And he set one rule. If a person was in pain, they were treated. Without authorization, without permission, without conditions. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she asked why he was doing this. Daniel told the truth. He said he needed a healer. That adventurers arrive wounded, and that ointments and potions are good but not enough. That having a healer in the shop is a new level of service that no one else offers. That he was offering her a job, not charity, a job, with pay, with housing, with the right to treat whoever she wants and however she wants. Yuna was silent. Then she asked what if the order found out. Daniel said the order would find out, just like the anchor found out. And just like the anchor, the order would realize that kicking out a healer who treats wounded adventurers for free and for money is very bad for their reputation. Yuna looked at him. Then she said quietly that he was a very strange merchant. Daniel said that he'd been told that before. 3 days later, a treatment corner appeared at point number 2. A stone bench, clean cloth, water, a selection of herbs that Yuna had gathered that day on the lower levels of the 39th floor. Her magic was powerful, not fireballs or lightning. A quiet, warm glow from her hands that closed wounds, reduced inflammation, and drew out poison. The first patient was an adventurer with a dislocated shoulder. Yuna said it in a minute. He groaned in pain and then froze because the pain was gone. Just gone. He looked at his shoulder. He looked at Yuna. He looked at Daniel. He asked how much. Daniel said 5 silver. At the Bronze Bone, the order's healers charged 15 for a shoulder reset. The adventurer's face wore an expression Daniel had seen many times. The expression of a man who doesn't believe he's not being lied to. He paid. He left. And he told everyone he met. By the 5th month, the Handmart underground network looked like this. Location number 1 at the fork on the 38th floor. Trading. Repairs. Consignment appraisal of trophies. Pete behind the counter. Location number 2 on the 39th floor. Trading. Repairs. Medical corner. Sora splits her time between the 2 locations as scheduled. Evelyn splits her time between the 2 locations as needed. Yuna treats patients. Myrna supplies goods. Bart supplies goods. Olga supplies goods. Greg handles advertising. Horst and his squad stop by every 2 weeks as regular customers. The monthly revenue from the 2 locations was about 20 gold. Net profit 8. That was a lot by the standards of a small merchant in the dungeon, and a pitifully small amount by the standards of what Daniel was planning.
He needed at least 3 more locations. On the 22nd floor, closer to the surface. On the 45th, where the spring had dried up and mid-level adventurers were left without supplies. And on the 50th, where the route to the deeper floors passed. Each location cost between 10 and 20 gold pieces to set up. He had 8. He needed leverage, a tool that would allow him to grow faster than profits allowed. And he found it. Not a tool, a person. She arrived in the 6th week of the 5th month. A young woman in a travel cloak, clean, well-tailored. Under the cloak, light chainmail. At her belt, a slender sword in an expensive scabbard. Her gait was confident. Her back was straight. Her hands were well manicured. Her nails were clean. Daniel looked at her and saw 3 things. First, she's no adventurer. Adventurers walk differently. They have bruised knuckles, dirt under their nails, and a gaze that's constantly checking the corners. This woman had a gaze that checked people.
Not the corners. Second, she's rich. Her cloak cost at least 5 gold pieces. Her chainmail was custom made. Her sword was decorative but expensive. Third, she didn't come to buy, she came to look. She walked into the shop. She surveyed the room, the counter, the display case, the price boards, the brazier, the vestibule, the medical corner. She approached the display case. She stared at the plaques with the masters' names for a long time. She turned to Daniel. She smiled. She said she was a traveling merchant named Lin and that she was looking for business partners on the middle floors. Daniel smiled back. He offered her tea. She accepted. They sat by the brazier. She asked questions, lots of them, smart ones. Where he sourced his potions, what the profit margin was on repairs, how many customers a day, what the conversion rate was from passers-by to buyers, what his expansion plans were. Daniel answered, honestly, but not everything. He answered the question about conversion. When asked about expansion plans, he said he had plans, but was only discussing the details with his team for now. She nodded. She appreciated that. That was an answer too. She came for 3 days. She arrived in the morning every day. She sat in the corner of the hall. She drank tea. She observed. She jotted something down in a small notebook. On the 3rd evening, Daniel sat down next to her. He said that a traveling merchant named Lin had a very expensive notebook, leather, embossed, with a brass clasp. They made notebooks like that in Upper Arcaden, the capital, made to order, for people of a certain circle. She looked at him. Her smile changed. It wasn't a sales smile anymore. It was genuine. He continued. He said that a traveling merchant named Lin had a way of taking notes that was taught at the Arcaden Trade Academy, the Faculty of Strategic Management. 2-column notation. The left column for facts, the right for conclusions. It's a system developed by Lord Ashford, founder of the Silver Anchor Guild. She was silent. He said her name wasn't Lin. He said that judging by her age and training, and by the way she held her sword, with her left hand. And Lord Ashford was left-handed, and according to the family chronicles, he taught his children to fence with their left hands. He surmised that she was Madeline Ashford, the eldest daughter of the head of the Silver Anchor. She sat motionless, a notebook in her hands, her face calm. But the pulse in her neck was beating faster. Daniel waited. Then he said one more thing. He said he wasn't going to kick her out. He said that if she'd come to spy, then let her spy for real. He placed a parchment in front of her. The network's financial records for the past 2 months. The real ones, not the ones prepared for public viewing. With numbers, with problems, with loss-making positions, with debts. He said that if she was going to report to her father, she should report the truth and not what Daniel would paint for her. Because the truth is more interesting. Madeline Ashford looked at the parchment, then at Daniel, then back at the parchment. She took it. She read for 5 minutes, in silence. Then she looked up, her eyes were shining. But not from tears, from interest. She said he was an idiot, that his profit margin on low-grade potions was negative when you factored in shipping costs. That the cost of charcoal for the brazier could be cut in half if he used charcoal pressed from Sora's furnace waste instead of regular charcoal. That his accounting system was primitive, and in 3 months he'd be drowning in numbers. That the logistics between the 2 points were set up wrong. Pete was running back and forth, but what was needed was a circular route through suppliers. Daniel listened. Every word was right. Every comment hit the nail on the head. Things he'd seen but hadn't had time to fix. She was better than him at strategy, significantly better. Because she'd been taught this since childhood, the academy, tutors, 5 languages, math, rhetoric. Daniel was a man of action. She was an analyst. Together, they were dangerous. He asked her one question. He asked what she wanted. Not what she could do, not why she had come, what she wanted. Madeline fell silent. You could see it on her face. She had expected any question but that one. She was asked what she could do, every day. Her father, her teachers, her mentors, partners. What can you do, Madeline? What can you offer us, Madeline? How are you useful, Madeline? No one had ever asked what she wanted. She was silent for a long time. Then she said she wanted to build something of her own. Not her father's, something of her own. Daniel nodded. He said he needed a chief strategist, someone who could think 6 months ahead, someone who would spot mistakes before they turned into losses, someone who would build a system that works without his presence. He said he'd pay 30 silver coins a week. Housing on the second floor of location number 2. Complete freedom in methods. One condition, honesty. If she reports to her father, that's her business. But he wants to know exactly what she's reporting. Madeline thought, for a moment. Then she said her father had sent her to destroy his business from the inside. Daniel said he knew. She said she wouldn't do it. Daniel said he knew that too. She asked how he knew. He said that someone who wants to destroy something doesn't sit around for 3 days looking for errors in the books. Someone who wants to destroy something doesn't look at the numbers with that kind of expression. She looked at the numbers the way Sora looked at a repaired boiler, with hunger. Madeline Ashford, 21 years old, heiress to the continent's largest trading guild. She became the chief strategist for the Hanmart Underground Network on a salary of 30 silver coins a week. It was absurd. It was wonderful. She started working that very evening. By morning, she had a 3-page document ready. Logistics restructuring, optimization of purchase prices, a new accounting system, an expansion plan for 3 locations with cost estimates and payback calculations for each. Daniel read and nodded silently. Every point was accurate, every figure verifiable, every decision logical. He looked at her. She was sitting at a desk on the second floor, her hair pulled back, a notebook open, a pen in her right hand, though she fenced with her left. Her eyes were focused, alive. For the first time in 3 days, she wasn't playing a role. She was working. He said the plan was good. She said the plan was perfect. He said there were no perfect plans. She said there were if she made them. He almost laughed, almost. But he smiled, and she smiled back. The first real smile in 3 days. Maddie. He started calling her Maddie the next day. She didn't object. Maddie reorganized everything in 3 weeks. Logistics first. Instead of Pete's chaotic dashes between locations and suppliers, she mapped out a loop route. In the morning, Pete would leave from location number 2. He'd go to Myrna for ointment, from Myrna to Bart for meat, from Bart to point number 1 at the fork. He handed the goods over to Pete Sr. That's what they started calling the kid to distinguish him from Pete Jr. Pete Jr. was hired by Maddie. He was 16, an orphan from the 37th floor, quick and quiet. He picked up the goods at the fork and carried them to the bronze bone. At the bronze bone, he picked up potions from Olga and carried them back to point number 2. The loop closed by noon, every day, like clockwork. Expenses logistics costs dropped by 40%. Then the accounting. Maddie implemented double-entry bookkeeping. Left column, income. Right column, expenses. Total at the bottom, every day, for each location. Daniel knew this system. It was called double-entry bookkeeping. In his world, it had been invented in Italy in the 15th century. Here, it had been invented by Maddie Ashford in the basement of the trading post on the 39th floor of the underworld. Or so she thought. Daniel didn't tell her. Let her be proud. Then there was pricing. Maddie reviewed every item in the inventory. She divided the goods into 4 categories. Anchor items, the ones that attract customers. Tea for 1 copper. Water for 1 copper. 0 or negative margin. The goal isn't profit, but foot traffic. Best sellers, the items everyone buys, often. Meat, crackers, low-grade potions. Margin 20 to 30%. Main revenue stream. Marginal items, the ones not everyone buys, but when they do, they pay well. Mid-grade potions, burn ointment, equipment repair. Margin 50 to 100%, main source of profit. Premium, rare, expensive, for select clients. Commission-based trade in crystals and deep cobalt. Custom-made items by Sora. Treatment of complex wounds at Yuna's. Margin 200 to 400%. Small volume but big money. Daniel looked at this matrix and recognized in it what he himself had used at Hanmart, the very same structure. the one he explained to interns during their first week on the job. Maddie had arrived at this on her own, a different path, through a different logic, but to the same result. It was like meeting someone who speaks a different language but thinks the same way. He told her the matrix was correct. She said she knew. Then she added one thing he wouldn't have said himself. She said a fifth category was needed: free. Tea for those who just dropped by, warmth, water, treatment for children. Things that don't bring in money but build reputation. Reputation converts to money. Not immediately, but it converts. Daniel looked at her. He said that wasn't a product category. It was a relationship category. Maddie thought about it. Then she nodded. She said it was the best way of putting it she'd ever heard. By the 6th month, the chain was ready for the next step. Point number 3. Maddie chose the location. Not the 45th floor as Daniel had planned, the 22nd, closer to the surface. Daniel asked why. Maddie explained. On the 22nd floor was a major transit hub. This is where novice adventurers formed groups and headed down. This is where they also returned to the surface with their loot. The traffic was massive. But the market was controlled by the Silver Anchor, completely. 3 shops, all anchors. Monopoly prices, low quality, no service. Daniel said that meant direct conflict with the Anchor. Maddie said the conflict was already underway. The Anchor already knew about them, had already sent a representative, had already lost the first round. The question wasn't whether there would be a conflict. The question was where it will be. Better on their territory where they don't expect a strike than here where they control the routes. Daniel thought. She was right, strategically. But tactically, opening a shop in Anchor's monopoly zone was like pitching a tent in the middle of someone else's camp. Maddie said that's exactly why they needed to do it quickly and loudly. Not hide, to make a splash. So everyone would know. So it would be impossible to shut them down quietly. Daniel asked where the money was coming from. Maddie pulled a sheet of paper from her notebook, a financing plan. She'd found the money, not in the chain's profits, in commission-based trade. Over the past 2 months, trophies totaling 80 gold had passed through Daniel. His 10% commission amounted to 8 gold. But that was a commission for brokering a single deal. What if they scaled it up? What if they turned commission-based trading into an exchange? Not for one client at a time, but for 10 simultaneously. Maddie proposed an auction. Once a week, adventurers bring in trophies. Buyers come from Bronzebone in the upper floors. Daniel organizes the venue. He takes 10% of every transaction. The volume at an auction is 10 times greater than with a per-item commission. Daniel looked at her. An auction? He hadn't thought of that. He thought like a retailer. She thought like a financier. Different scales. The first auction was held 2 weeks later. At location number 2, the hall was small but adequate. Maddie organized it. She sent out invitations through Greg and Horst. Pete Sr. distributed flyers along routes 38 and 39. 12 sellers and 8 buyers showed up. There was 40 gold worth of goods for sale. Daniel conducted the auction himself. He stood behind the counter. He announced the lots. He called out the starting price. Buyers raised their hands. He counted. He recorded. He processed the transactions. Everything was transparent. Everything was out in the open. Every transaction was recorded on parchment. The seller received a copy. The buyer received a copy. Daniel kept the third. The auction lasted 3 hours. Total turnover was 52 gold pieces. Daniel's commission was 5 gold and 20 silver pieces. For 3 hours, more than the entire network's net profit for a week. Maddie stood in the corner of the hall and took notes. When the last buyer left, she approached Daniel. He was sitting behind the counter, looking at the parchments. 5 gold, 20 silver. In a single evening, Maddie said the next auction would be bigger, that they needed to expand the list of buyers, that they needed to attract merchants from the surface, that in 3 months the auction could bring in 15 to 20 gold pieces a week. Daniel nodded, then he looked at her. He said she hadn't sent the report to her father yet. Maddie fell silent. Then she said she wouldn't send it. She said her father had sent her to destroy, but she wanted to build. Daniel didn't answer. He just nodded. That was enough. The following week, they began preparing to open location number 3 on the 22nd floor. Maddie drew up a plan, a budget, timelines, a risk assessment. Daniel read it and made revisions. They argued. A lot. Loudly. About prices. About the location. About the staff. Maddie wanted to hire 10 people. Daniel said 5 was enough. Maddie wanted a luxurious display window. Daniel said the display window should be nice but not luxurious. Luxury scares off poor customers. And poor customers on the 22nd floor account for 80% of the traffic. Maddie argued. Then she agreed. Or she disagreed and found a third option. They complemented each other. Like gears that aren't the same shape but turn the same mechanism. One evening, after yet another argument about pricing policy for the 22nd floor, Maddie sat at the table and stared at her notebook. Then she looked up and spoke quietly. She said that her father never argued with her. He gave orders. She obeyed. If she objected, he wouldn't listen. If she insisted, he got angry. In her 21 years of life, no one had ever argued with her as an equal. Daniel stood by the wall and listened. Then he said that an argument isn't disrespect. An argument is when two people search together for the best answer. If one of them stays silent, the answer will be worse. Maddie looked at him. For a long time. The 22nd floor greeted them with light. Not sunlight. There was no sun here. But the ceiling on the 22nd floor was covered with a thick layer of fluorescent moss that glowed bright yellow and gave the feeling of eternal midday. After the dark tunnels of the 38th and 39th levels, it took their eyes about 10 minutes to adjust. Then the view opened up. A huge cavern. The ceiling was 30 meters high. In the center lay the stopover town of Medni Parag. Not a city in the usual sense, more like a bazaar. 2 or 3-story stone buildings standing in a ring around the central square. In the square, rows of shops. Tents, stalls, caravans, crowds of people. Adventurers of the first and second ranks. Newcomers with shining eyes and cheap swords. Veterans with dull eyes and expensive swords. Merchants, barkers, mercenaries, beggars, priests, thieves. Everything is mixed together. It's noisy. It smells of roasted meat, sweat, and copper. The 3 shops of the Silver Anchor stood in the western part of the square. 3 stone buildings under identical signs, an anchor inside a shield, identical counters, identical merchandise, identical prices, high. A potion of the lowest cost 12 copper coins here. At the fork in the road, Daniel sold them for 8. Repairing a breastplate cost 12 silver coins. Sora did it for 3. The difference wasn't greed. The difference was monopoly. When you're the only seller, price isn't a matter of fairness. It's a matter of how much the buyer is willing to pay before walking away empty-handed. And on the 22nd floor, there was nowhere to go if you walked away empty-handed. Daniel stood at the edge of the plaza and watched. Maddie stood beside him. Evelyn was behind him. Sora didn't show up. She stayed on the 39th floor. You can't just abandon Horn. Una stayed too. Patience. Only Pete Sr. and Maddie were here with them, and 2 bags of money. Maddie found a spot. Not on the plaza, nearby, in a side tunnel leading to the east exit from the floor. Every adventurer heading down passed through this tunnel, and everyone coming back, a bottleneck, the perfect spot to intercept them. The building was small, 1 story, someone's old storage room, stone walls, a slab roof, 1 room. Maddie rented it from the old caretaker for 2 gold pieces a month. Expensive. But Maddie calculated that with 200 people a day and a 5% conversion rate, the spot would pay for the rent in the first week. Daniel trusted her calculations. The renovation took 5 days. It went quickly because the building was small.
Sora sent over the finished shelves, hinges, and countertop in pieces with Pete Jr. Daniel and Pete Sr. put it all together in a day. Maddie hung up the sign. Handmart Underground, location number 3. White clay letters on dark stone. Next to it was Sora's little hammer. The opening was a big hit, just as Maddie had planned. She did something Daniel would never have thought of. She organized a free giveaway. On opening day, everyone who walked into the shop received a mug of hot tea and a piece of jerky. Free, no strings attached. The giveaway cost 80 copper coins. Pete stood at the tunnel entrance and called out to everyone passing by. New shop, free tea, free meat, right here. 40 people came in during the first hour, 30 more during the second. By noon, the small room was packed. People drank tea, ate meat, looked at the counter, looked at the prices. Low-grade potion, 8 copper coins. At the nearby shops, 12. Meat, 5 copper coins. At Yakor's, 8. Burn ointment, 10 copper coins. Yakor didn't have any ointment. Yakor only had potions, and swords, and shields, and armor, the standard set. No trinkets, no ointment, no tea, no repairs. No signs with the craftsmen's names, no schedule board, no brazier, no vestibule, no smile behind the counter. By the end of the first day, the takings amounted to 3 gold coins, in a single day.
more than the entire first location had brought in for a week during the first month. Maddie stood in the corner and did the math in her notebook. She looked up. She said that at this rate, the shop would pay for itself in 2 weeks. Daniel nodded, but he wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking out the window, more precisely, at the tunnel. There, in the shadows, stood a man watching the shop entrance. A crisp shirt, a silver pin on his lapel, an anchor, a silver anchor observer. They'd recognized him on the very first day. Daniel had expected this. So had Maddie. The plan was simple. Work. Work fast. Work so well that shutting them down would be impossible without a scandal. The first week the anchor watched. The second, he began to act. Not brutally, more subtly. On Monday morning of the second week, Daniel didn't receive a shipment of potions from Olga. Pete Jr. returned from Bronzebone empty-handed. He said Olga hadn't opened the door. Daniel sent Pete Sr. to check. Pete returned 3 hours later. Olga was crying. She said that people from the anchor had come to see her. They told her that if she continued supplying Daniel, her shop in Bronzebone would be shut down by order of the Trade Council. The Bronzebone Trade Council was controlled by the anchor. Daniel stood behind the counter and thought. The first serious blow. Not aimed at him, at the supplier. A classic move. Strike not at the target, but at those who supply it. Cut off the supply lines. He knew this move, and he knew how to counter it. He needed an alternative supplier, or better yet, his own production. He looked at Maddie. Maddie was already thinking. She said that on the 25th floor lived a reclusive alchemist named Farn, a former master of the Alchemists Guild. He left the guild 20 years ago. He brews potions for himself, sells to whoever he wants. The anchor has no power over him because he depends on no one. Daniel asked how she knew. Maddie said that in her father's archives there were files on every independent alchemist in the dungeon. Her father collected them to know who could be bought and who couldn't. Farn couldn't be bought. That meant the anchor ignored him. That meant he was free. Daniel sent Maddie to negotiate. He didn't go himself. Maddie, because Maddie knew how to talk to people who had turned their backs on the world. She was one of them. Maddie returned 2 days later, with a contract to supply mid- and low-grade potions. Farn agreed. Not for money, for a condition. His name on a plaque next to the merchandise, like Myrna's. For 20 years, he'd brewed potions that no one had seen. He wanted them to be seen. Daniel nodded. It was free. It was priceless. The anchor's blow against Olga resulted in the network gaining the best alchemist. Daniel sent Olga a letter. He wrote that he understood, that he held no grudge, that if the situation ever changed, the doors were open. Olga didn't reply. But a month later, she started sending small shipments through intermediaries, silently, without a contract. She simply left the packages on Myrna's doorstep. Myrna brought them to Daniel. No one spoke of it aloud. Anchor struck a second blow in the third week, not against the suppliers, against the customers. Rumors began to circulate in Medni Pirog. Someone was saying that the potions from the shop in the eastern tunnel were fake, that the ointment was dangerous, that the merchant was a con artist from the lower floors who was swindling newbies. Daniel found out from Greg. Greg came in angry. He said that some adventurer in the tavern was claiming that Daniel's ointment had made his hand. Greg asked that adventurer who he was and which floor he was from. The adventurer hesitated and left. A mercenary. Anchor was paying people to spread rumors, a cheap trick, but effective. Against the newbies on the 22nd floor who didn't know Daniel and hadn't seen his work, the rumors worked. Traffic on the third week dropped by 30%. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. Then he did what he always did. He didn't fight the lies, he showed the truth. He took his counter out onto the street. He set it up at the entrance to the tunnel. He laid out his merchandise. He placed a sign next to it. Free potion inspection. Bring any potion bought at any shop. We'll check its authenticity and quality. Free of charge. Adventurers came. They brought potions. Their own. Bought from Anchor. Bought from small vendors. Daniel checked each one. Yuna, whom he had summoned from the 39th floor for a week, determined the composition using her magic. The result was recorded on parchment and given to the customer. On the first day, they tested 30 potions. Of those, 8 bought at Anchor's shops turned out to be diluted. Daniel didn't say this out loud. He simply wrote it down on parchment. Potion of inferior quality. Purchased at such and such a place. Composition. Active ingredient concentration 60% of the norm. The customer read it. The customer looked at the parchment. The customer went to Anchor, not to Daniel, to Anchor, and asked questions. Over the course of a week, foot traffic to Anchor's shops dropped by 20%. Rumors about Daniel's counterfeit potions died out on their own. They were replaced by other rumors about Anchor's diluted potions. Daniel didn't spread these rumors. He didn't need to. The truth spread on its own. By the end of the 6th month, location number 3 was the most profitable in the chain. Monthly revenue, 15 gold. Net profit, 6. The 3 locations together generated 35 gold in revenue and 14 in net profit per month. Daniel sat on the porch of location number 2 and looked at the numbers. 6 months ago, he had 200 copper coins, 2 gold pieces. Now his chain was worth about 100 gold pieces, counting inventory, equipment, and contracts. A 50-fold increase. In 6 months. Evelyn stood nearby. Sora was hammering away inside. Yuna was quietly talking to a patient. Maddie was doing calculations in her notebook. Pete Sr. had returned from Bronzebone with a sack of goods. Younger Pete was cleaning the counter. Myrna brought a double batch of ointment. Bart delivered the meat. Daniel looked at them all. At the people who, 6 months ago, had been strangers, broken, lonely. Now they were a network, not a commercial one, a human one. And that evening, for the first time in 6 months, he thought of Marcus Steele. Not with anger. With something akin to sadness. She appeared one evening toward the end of the 7th month. Daniel was closing up shop number 1 at the fork in the road. He came here once a week, to check on Pitt Sr., to check the stock, to check the walls and the roof, to sit by the brazier. This was his place, his first, his home. He was washing the counter when he sensed someone standing in the corner of the room. Not by the entrance, inside, behind the display case, in the shadows. A small figure, silver hair, gray eyes. A girl of 14 or 15, skinny, in a simple, unadorned dress, barefoot. She stood and looked at the display case, not at the merchandise, at the reflection of the brazier's fire in the glass. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't call out to her, just watched. She stood so quietly that it was unclear how she had entered. Evelyn was standing by the door. Evelyn noticed everyone. Everyone. Always. But she hadn't noticed this girl. Daniel looked at Evelyn. Evelyn stood with her back to the room, staring down the tunnel. She didn't see the girl, didn't hear her, as if the girl weren't there. But Daniel saw her. He put down the rag. He pulled a pillow from under the counter, a woolen blanket. He placed it in the corner by the brazier. He set a mug of tea next to it. He didn't say a word. He went back behind the counter. He continued wiping. The girl stood there. She looked at the pillow, at the blanket, at the tea. Then she walked over, quietly, without a sound. She sat down on the pillow, wrapped herself in the blanket, took the mug in both hands, drank slowly, in small sips, eyes closed. An expression on her face that Daniel had seen only once in his life. On a child at an orphanage in Los Angeles where Hanmart delivered charitable food donations for Christmas. A received a box of food and pressed it to his chest. He didn't eat. He just held it close, as if he let go, it would disappear. Daniel finished washing the counter. He closed the shop. Evelyn locked the door. She turned around. She saw the girl. She froze, her hand on her sword. She looked at Daniel. Daniel shook his head. Evelyn slowly lowered her hand, but she didn't take her eyes off her. The girl wasn't looking at Evelyn. She was looking into the mug. Daniel went to bed. In the morning, the girl was in the same spot. A pillow, a blanket, an empty mug nearby, her eyes open. She was looking at Daniel. He got up, washed his face, poured her some more tea, placed a cracker next to it. He opened the shop. He worked all day. The girl sat in the corner, silent, motionless. The customers paid no attention to her, as if they didn't see her, just like Evelyn last night. But Daniel saw her, and Sora saw her. Sora came out of the workshop and stopped. She looked at the girl, then at Daniel. Daniel shrugged. Sora walked over to the girl, sat down next to her, silently. Sat there for a minute, then went back to the kiln. That evening, Daniel asked Evelyn if she could see the girl. Evelyn said she could. She could see her now. She hadn't seen her yesterday. She couldn't explain why. She said the girl wasn't dangerous, but strange. Daniel nodded. He didn't ask the girl any questions. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she was from, why she was there, or who her parents were. If she wanted to, she'd say. If not, then not. He just set out tea and a cracker for her every day. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. Just tea. Just that tea from the icebox that he brewed himself. A week later, she spoke. One word. Daniel was standing behind the counter brewing tea. She was sitting in the corner. He set the mug next to her. She took it, drank, then said quietly, "Lena." Daniel looked at her. She was staring into the mug. She repeated it. "Lena." He nodded. Said it was nice to meet her. She didn't answer, but the corners of her lips twitched. Lena stayed. Day after day, week after week. She sat in the corner at spot number 1. Sometimes she moved to spot number 2. She appeared and disappeared. No one knew how. Evelyn stopped trying to understand. Sora got used to it. Yuna once tried to check her with magic. Then she pulled her hands back. She turned pale. She told Daniel she couldn't explain what she'd felt. She said there was something enormous inside that girl, like an ocean or like a mountain, something ancient and infinitely weary. Daniel listened. Then he looked at Lena. Lena was sitting in the corner holding a mug. A little girl with silver hair who loved cold brewed tea. Whatever was inside her, on the outside she was a child who needed a corner and a mug, and someone who didn't ask questions. Daniel could give her that. That was what he was good at. The 8th month brought growth. The trophy auction became weekly. Maddie the list of buyers. She invited merchants from the surface. 2 came from Upper Arcaden. Turnover rose to 80 gold per auction. Commission, 8 gold a week, 32 a month, more than all retail trade combined. Daniel opened outpost number 4 on the 45th floor, where the second spring had dried up. He fixed that one, too. 3 days with a pickaxe, calluses on the calluses. But the water flowed. Outlet number 4 became a water station. Clean water, hot tea, potions, ointment, repairs. Yuna hired an assistant, a girl named Tana, a former novice of the order who left on her own without waiting to be expelled. Yuna taught her how to heal. Daniel paid them both. By the 9th month, the Hanmart underground network consisted of 4 locations. On the 22nd, on the 38th, on the 39th, and on the 45th. 14 staff members. Monthly revenue, including auctions, was 70 gold. Net profit was 25. Daniel sat on the 2nd floor of location number 2, poring over the ledgers and doing the math. Maddie sat across from him. Between them was a table piled high with parchments. Maddie looked up from her notebook. She said 2 words. The 5th floor. Daniel said he was thinking about the 50th floor. Maddie shook her head. She said the 50th would have to wait. She said they needed the 30th, because the 30th was the intersection of 3 routes. Whoever controlled the 30th controlled supplies from the 22nd to the 45th. Daniel thought. She was right. The 30th was the hub. 3 routes converged at a single point. The eastern one led to the bronze bone, the western one to the lower levels, the northern one to an alternate exit to the surface. Whoever stood on the 30th could see all the traffic. Daniel nodded. The 30th. Maddie smiled. That smile meant the plan was already set, and she was asking for permission out of politeness. In the 10th month, location number 5 opened. The nickname came naturally. One of the customers said it out loud at the Bronze Bone Tavern. God of the counter. Daniel heard it from Greg. Greg had stopped by for some meat and casually mentioned that on the 22nd floor, that's what they call him. God of the counter. The guy in the apron who knows what you need before you even realize it yourself. Daniel grimaced. He said it was unnecessary. Greg shrugged. He said people decide for themselves what to call whom. God of the counter. Daniel thought that Marcus Steele would be thrilled with such a nickname. Marcus loved titles. Marcus was a hero, with a capital H. And Daniel was the god of the counter, with a capital G, too. The difference was that Marcus had chosen his title, and Daniel's had been given to him by those to whom he'd sold a mug of tea for a penny. Marcus Steele arrived in the 11th month. Daniel was at station number 3 in Copper Threshold. He was checking the morning delivery, counting the jars of ointment. He looked up and saw him. Golden hair, a white cloak, the coat of arms with a star and a sword. Marcus stood at the entrance and looked around. His face was different. After nearly a year in the depths of the dungeon, he had changed. He had lost weight. His cheekbones were sharper. There were shadows under his eyes. His cloak was dirty, not white but gray, with patches, poorly done patches, not Daniel's. Whoever had mended it crookedly and with thread of the wrong color. Marcus saw Daniel. He stopped. A series of expressions flashed across his face. Surprise, confusion, something like awkwardness. Then a smile. That very one, patronizing, golden. He approached. He said he'd heard about him. He said he was glad things had worked out for Daniel. He said it in that voice people use when they say, good for you, you managed without me. Daniel was standing behind the counter, in a clean apron. He looked at Marcus. A year ago, this man had kicked him out on the 60th floor with $200 and a butcher's knife. A year ago, Daniel nodded and walked away, silently. Now he stood behind the counter of his own chain of 5 stores, looking at the man who had considered him dead weight. He felt no anger. He felt no triumph. He felt exhaustion, and somewhere deep beneath the weariness, something warm and sad, as if you were looking at an old photograph and realizing that the person in it no longer exists. Marcus spoke up. He said the hero's party was on the 85th floor. He said the breath had risen and the situation was dire. He said they'd found Daniel through Greg and decided to stop by on their way up. They were heading up for supplies. Things were bad down below. The way stations were emptying out. Tea merchants are fleeing. The supply lines are destroyed. The party is spending its time not fighting the source but searching for food and potions. Then he got down to business. He said he wanted to offer Daniel a chance to return to the party. Not as a pack mule, as a supplier, an official one, with a contract. The heroes' party would purchase everything they needed from Handmart Underground. Daniel would be paid from the guild fund. Big money, prestige, status. He said this with a smile, as if it were a favor. Daniel listened. He waited. Not money. Words. Marcus was talking about a return, but on his terms, under his control. Supplier to the heroes' party. It sounded nice, but it meant dependence. One client, one contract, one point of failure. If Marcus decided to terminate the contract, the network would lose its main customer. If Marcus delayed payment, the network would suffocate. Daniel knew this trap. Handmart had one major corporate client that accounted for 40% of its revenue. When that client left, the branch nearly shut down. Never again. Daniel looked at Marcus. He said he was glad to see him. He meant it sincerely because he was glad, somewhere deep down. Then he said he wouldn't be coming back, not as a driver, not as a supplier. He said the chain doesn't rely on a single client. But he said something else. He said Marcus had poor gear. You could tell by his chest plate, a crack in the right plate. The strap on his left shoulder was frayed. The potions on his belt were low grade, when at 85, you need medium grade or higher. His cloak was so patched up it would fall apart at the next rain. He said Marcus shouldn't sign a contract but come back tomorrow. We'll draw up an estimate. Marcus stood there listening. The smile was gone. His face grew hard. He wasn't used to being turned down. Heroes don't get turned down. Heroes get gratitude and bows and gold and admiration. Not rejections from former cart drivers and aprons. He said that Daniel was making a mistake. He said that the heroes' party was a mission from all the guilds. That to refuse the party was to refuse the guilds. That there would be consequences. Daniel looked at him. Marcus was threatening, not rudely, elegantly, as best he could. A smile and a threat in a single sentence. Daniel remembered that night by the fire on the 60th floor. The same smile, the same gentle pressure. Sorry, Dan, but you're holding us back. He said one sentence. He said that the network's doors were open to everyone, and to Marcus too, just like a client, not like a boss. Marcus stood there, silent. Then he turned and walked out. Evelyn stood by the wall. She watched him go. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel went back to counting the ointment jars. His hands didn't shake. His voice didn't tremble. But inside, something ached. Not from the conflict, from the realization that Marcus hadn't changed, and wouldn't change. He was a hero. Heroes don't change. They win or they die. There is no third option for them. And Daniel was the third option. 2 days later, Haley arrived. She looked worse than Marcus. Thinner, quieter. The bow on her back was worn. The string was new, but the rest was old. She stood at the entrance to point number 2 on the 39th floor and looked at the sign. Handmart Underground. She stared at it for a long time. Then she went inside. She saw Daniel. She stopped. He looked at her. Haley North, the archer. The only one at that bonfire who said out loud that the banishment was wrong. The one they silenced. The one who stayed silent afterward. She stood there and looked at him. Then she said one word. I'm sorry. Daniel came out from behind the counter. He walked over to her. He said she hadn't done anything wrong. She said it was wrong. They didn't hear her. It wasn't her fault. Haley stood there and listened. Her eyes were shining. She wasn't crying, but she was close. Daniel said the tea was hot. She laughed, quietly, briefly, almost a sob, but she laughed. They sat by the brazier, Haley told him. She said she'd left the party 3 months ago. She couldn't take it anymore. Not Marcus, not the danger, herself. Every day she looked in the mirror and saw a person who stayed silent when she should have shouted. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort her. He listened. When she finished, he asked what she wanted to do. Haley said she didn't know. She said she knew how to shoot and talk. She was the only one in the party who negotiated with the guilds. Marcus was the face. Haley was the voice. Everyone knew her. All the upper guilds, all the trade councils, all the commanders of major units. Daniel looked at her. He said he needed a voice, an official representative for the network, someone who would negotiate with the guilds, with the trade councils, with the squad commanders. The face of Hanmart Underground to the outside world. Haley looked at him. Then she said it was ridiculous. She had left the heroes' party and was now going to work for the man that party had expelled. Daniel said the world works in funny ways. Haley became the 6th key member of the team. Evelyn, Sora, Yuna, Maddie, Lena, Haley. 6 women gathered around a single merchant in an apron. Each had arrived broken. Each had found a place. Each did what she wanted, not what she was told. Daniel looked at them sometimes. In the evening when the shop closed and they all ended up together. Sora by the stove, Yuna at the table with herbs, Maddie over her notebook, Evelyn by the door, Haley writing a letter to some guild official, Lena in the corner with a mug, and Daniel in the middle, with a rag in the counter. He watched them and thought. He really had helped each of them, gave them a place, gave them work, gave them purpose. But he made money off of it. Each of them brought him profit. Evelyn protected his business. Sora built his counters. Yuna attracted customers. Maddie devised the strategy. Haley opened doors. He was getting rich off of them. And every time one of them said she wanted to stay, he heard a question inside himself. Are you staying because you like it here, or because you have nowhere else to go? He didn't know the answer, and he was afraid he wouldn't like it. A year and 2 months after the expulsion, the buzz had reached the 80th floor. Daniel didn't learn this from rumors. He learned it from the numbers. The flow of clients at points 4 and 5 had doubled in a week. Adventurers were heading up, not alone, in groups. With twisted faces and empty bags, they were running. The floors below the 80th had become unpredictable. The monsters had mutated. Species appeared that weren't found in any bestiary. Routes changed every day. Passages that were open yesterday turned out to be blocked or filled with poisonous fog today. The way stations between the 60th and 80th were deserted. The merchants fled first, then the artisans, then everyone else. Mid-level adventurers got stuck between floors, without food, without potions, without repairs, without information. The heroes' party was somewhere below. On the 85th or deeper, there was no contact with them. The guilds on the surface were discussing and deliberating and drafting resolutions. No one was doing anything. Daniel stood behind the counter at Station 2 and listened to Haley's report. Haley had returned from Upper Arcaden, where she had been negotiating with the Trade Council. She said the council had expressed concern, that they were discussing the creation of a committee, that the committee would review the proposals in a month. Daniel looked at her. Haley shrugged. She said that's how bureaucracy works. A month for the committee, a month for review, a month for a decision. In 3 months, the people on the middle floors will be dead. Daniel nodded. He called a meeting. The first in the network's history, all the key people. Evelyn, Sora, Yuna, Maddie, Haley. Lena sat in the corner and listened. Daniel spoke for 20 minutes, briefly, to the point. He outlined the situation. 80th floor. Thousands of adventurers cut off from supplies. The guilds won't help. The heroes' party is stuck. Infrastructure between the 60th and 80th floors is destroyed. Then he said what he was going to do. Every Hanmart underground location becomes an evacuation point. Gathering,
Warmth, medical care, food, information, re-equipping. All 5 locations, simultaneously. Maddie asked where the money would come from. Daniel said everything. The entire reserve fund. All profits from the last 3 months. Everything we have. Maddie looked at him. She said that's 40 gold. Everything the network had saved up. If they spent it all on the evacuation, the network would go bankrupt in 2 months. Daniel said he knew. Maddie was silent for a moment. Then she opened her notebook. She said that in that case, they had to make sure they didn't go bankrupt. She began to calculate. Within an hour, she had drawn up a plan. A tough one, precise, merciless on the numbers. Every location switches to wartime supply mode, minimal inventory, only the essentials, water, food, potions, bandages. No commission-based trade, no auctions. All staff assigned to support the evacuation. Logistics are reorganized. The circular route PETA is expanding to 5 locations.
2 couriers are being added. We're hiring right now. Suppliers are switching to emergency mode. Myrna is brewing ointment around the clock. Farn is tripling the volume of potions. Bart is butchering meat every day. Expenses are covered by the reserve. Revenue comes from volume. If 200 people pass through each point per day instead of 30, even with a minimal margin, revenue will cover expenses. Theoretically. Daniel looked at the plan. He said it would work. Maddie said it might not work. But there is no other plan. For the next 72 hours, Daniel didn't sleep. Literally. He ran between locations. He rearranged the counters. He hauled bags. He wrote instructions for the staff at every location. He negotiated with suppliers. He persuaded and explained and calculated and double-checked. Evelyn was by his side every second. Not because he asked her to, because she decided to. She didn't sleep either. She stood at every door he walked through. She followed him down every tunnel. When he stumbled from exhaustion on the stairs at point number 5, she grabbed him by the elbow. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said nothing. She held him until he straightened up. Then she let go. On the 3rd day, the system started working. The first wave of evacuees reached point number 4 on the 45th floor. 30 people. Exhausted, wounded, hungry. Yuna and Tana treated them non-stop. Sora repaired the equipment. Pete handed out food. Daniel stood at the entrance and counted people. He directed them. This one upstairs. This one to the healer. This one to eat first. This one needs to lie down. He can't walk. A conveyor belt. A living conveyor belt of people and decisions. By the end of the first week, 400 people had passed through the network. By the end of the second, 800. By the end of the third, over 1,000. Money was burning through. Reserves were dwindling. But Maddie was right. Volume made up for it. Not completely, but enough to keep the network alive. The adventurers paid what they could. Some couldn't pay anything. Daniel fed them for free. He wrote it down in a book, not as a debt, as a fact. So many people, so many portions, so many potions. He kept track not because he intended to demand payment, but because someday someone would ask what the Hanmart underground network did during the breath crisis, and he would have the numbers. At the end of the 3rd week of the evacuation, news arrived. The heroes' party was stuck on the 82nd floor. Supplies were running out. The way back was cut off. Marcus Steele and 5 members of the party were in a staging city that was emptying before their eyes. They had 3 days' worth of food left, potions for a single battle. The information came from a scout who had fought his way up from the 82nd floor, barely alive. Daniel stood at the counter and listened. Then he looked at Maddie. Maddie looked at him. She knew what he was going to say. He said it. A field delivery. To the 82nd floor.
Maddie said it was madness. Daniel said it was business. Marcus was a client in trouble. Maddie closed her notebook. She said she'd make a list. Daniel assembled a caravan in a day. 30 porters. From the adventurers he'd rescued over the past 3 weeks. Volunteers. Each carried a bag. Potions, food, water, bandages, tools, spare weapons. Evelyn led the guard. 8 fighters. Volunteers, too. Horst and his squad. 4th rank. They came on their own. Said they owed him a debt. The caravan traveled downhill for 4 days. Through levels already touched by the breath. Mutated monsters. Fog. Broken paths. Evelyn led the way using a map Daniel had compiled over the course of a year based on clients' accounts. The map saved their lives twice. On the 78th, they bypassed an ambush by creatures not listed in any bestiary. On the 80th, they found a bypass tunnel that wasn't on the official maps. Daniel walked with the caravan. He couldn't not go. Physically, he was a burden.
The shopkeeper's stats hadn't changed in a year. He still couldn't fight. He couldn't run faster than an ordinary person. He was gasping for breath on the stairs. But he walked. Because it was his caravan, his cargo, his decision. On the 5th day, they reached the 82nd floor. The way station city of Greystone. Half empty, dark. 6 people were sitting in the square by the well. Marcus, Borg, Celine, Alden, Rena, and Haley. Haley, who had left 3 months ago, who had been on Daniel's team, who had returned to the party when she learned they were in trouble. She was sitting next to Marcus, bandaging his arm. She looked up. She saw Daniel. She saw the caravan. She saw the bags. Tears welled up in her eyes. Marcus looked up. He saw the caravan. He saw the bags. He saw the people. He saw Daniel, standing at the front, in an apron, with an inventory book in his hands. Behind him were 30 porters and 8 fighters and sacks of supplies for a month. Written in white clay on the first sack was, Hanmart Underground, Field Delivery Number 47. Marcus stood up. He stood and watched. Daniel approached. He placed a box in front of him. Mid-grade potions, 20 vials. Food for 6 people for 30 days. Portioned, labeled. Bandages, ointment, spare straps for armor. A new bowstring, a raincoat repair kit. Daniel returned from the 82nd floor 6 days later. The caravan made the return trip lighter. The bags were empty. The people were tired but alive. All 30 porters, all 8 fighters. They hadn't lost a single one. Evelyn walked beside him. She was silent, as always. But her silence was different. Not the closed-off silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone who would say too much if she started. On the 39th floor, Maddie met them. She was standing in the doorway of point number 2 with a notepad. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red. She hadn't slept for 6 days either. She'd been running the entire network alone, coordinating supplies, counting money, directing people. When Daniel entered the room, she approached him and handed him a parchment, the weekly report. Daniel took it. He read it. During his absence, another 300 evacuees had passed through the network. Reserves were depleted. Cash reserves were close to zero. But the network was alive. All points were operational. Everyone was in their places. No one had left. No one had given up. He looked at Maddie, told her she'd done well. Maddie told him he was an idiot and that he'd never go anywhere again without her permission. Then she hugged him, quickly, for a second. She stepped back, returned to her notebook. Sora stood by the forge, silent, hands covered in soot, eyes wet. She had been forging non-stop for 6 days, repairing equipment for the evacuees, hinges, locks, knife mounts, an endless stream. When she saw Daniel, she nodded, once. She returned to the anvil. Yuna sat on a bench by the medical corner. Tana was beside her. Both were exhausted. Yuna had been healing non-stop. Her magic waned by evening every day and recovered by morning. She was wearing herself out. Daniel could see it in her face. Thinner, paler. The shadows under her eyes looked like bruises. He walked over, sat down next to her. Told her she'd rest tomorrow, all day, no patience. Yuna looked up at him, dark, deep. She said she couldn't. There were people. Daniel said there would be people the day after tomorrow, and in a week, and in a month. And if she burned herself out today, there would be no one left to treat anyone at all tomorrow. Yuna was silent. Then she nodded. He led her to a room on the 2nd floor. He brought tea. Yuna took the mug. She drank. She looked at him. Then she said quietly that in 10 years in the Order, no one had ever told her to rest. They said work, heal, serve, but don't rest. Daniel didn't answer. He just nodded. He closed the door. He went downstairs. Lena was on the 1st floor, in her corner, with a mug. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him. Gray eyes, silver hair, motionless, quiet. But something was different, something on the wall behind her. Daniel stepped closer. On the stone wall at spot number 1, where Lena usually sat, a symbol had appeared. It hadn't been there before. It hadn't been drawn. It hadn't been carved. It had emerged from the stone like veins in marble, complex, geometric, glowing with a dim, greenish light. Daniel looked at the symbol, then at Lena. Lena looked at him. For the first time, there was something on her face besides silence, something warm. She said quietly, "Thank you." Daniel blinked. Lena said more. She said she'd wanted someone to ask her what kind of tea she liked for a long time. Daniel didn't understand. He didn't understand what the symbol meant. He didn't understand why it had appeared. He didn't understand who Lena really was. Yuna had said there was something enormous inside her, something ancient, like the ocean. But now sitting in front of him was a girl talking about tea. And he did what he always did when you don't know what to say. He asked which tea she liked best, the iced one or that new mint one from the 5th floor. Lena thought about it. Seriously, as if it were the most important question in the world. Then she said the iced one, but the mint one was good too, if you added a little honey. Daniel nodded. He made a mental note. Iced tea with mint and honey, for Lena. The next 2 months were a period of recovery. The flow of evacuees slowed down. The breathing stopped on the 80th floor. It didn't retreat, but it stopped rising. No one knew why. Daniel thought about it. He thought about the coincidence. The breath stopped when the network was running at full capacity, when the 5 points became evacuation centers, when the flow began through them, when people stopped dying and started living between floors. A coincidence, probably. He had restored the network's finances in 2 months. Auctions resumed. Clients returned. Moreover, there were more of them, many more. The fame that Handmart Underground had saved 1,000 people during the crisis spread throughout the underworld. To the surface, to the guilds. The god of the counter ceased to be a nickname. It became a title. The silver anchor stopped resisting. Not because he lost in battle, because his customers left. Quietly, without a fuss. They just stopped coming. Why go to someone who deceives you when there is someone nearby who heals you? Lord Cedric Ashford sent a letter. Not a threat, an invitation to negotiations. Maddie read her father's letter with a stony face. Then she looked at Daniel. She said she would go with him. The negotiations lasted 4 hours. At a table in the upper hall of the Silver Anchor Guild in Upper Arcaden, Daniel sat across from Lord Cedric. Elegant, gray-haired, cold eyes. Maddie sat next to Daniel. 3 advisors sat next to Cedric. Daniel placed the network's financial records on the table. Complete. Open. Every figure. Every transaction. Every penny. Cedric read them for an hour, in silence. The advisors read and exchanged glances. When he finished, Daniel said one thing. He said that Cedric hadn't lost to him. He lost because times have changed. Because a monopoly works when people have nowhere else to go. But when choice appears, the monopoly crumbles. Not from war, from fair prices. And he offered Cedric a position. Director of Upper-Level Development. The Handmart Underground network is expanding upward. It needs someone who knows the surface markets. Someone with connections. Someone who knows how to build, not destroy. Build. Cedric looked at him, for a long time. Then he looked at Maddie. Maddie was looking at her father. She didn't look away. Cedric looked at Daniel again. He asked why. Why offer a position to a man who had tried to destroy him? Daniel said that Cedric hadn't tried to destroy him. He had tried to protect his world, his system, his daughter. The methods were bad. The motives weren't. Cedric was silent for a minute. Then he said he'd think about it. Daniel nodded. He stood up. He left. Maddie walked beside him. She was silent. Halfway to the exit, she said her father would agree. Not right away. In a month. When he's convinced there's no other way out. Daniel said he knew. Maddie looked at him. She said he always does that. He gives people time to come to the right decision on their own. He doesn't force them. He doesn't pressure them. He just lays out the honest numbers and waits. Daniel said that's the only way that works in the long run. Marcus returned 3 weeks after his talks with Cedric. He returned differently. Without a cloak, without armor, in simple travel clothes. He came to point number 1, to the fork in the road, to where it all began. He stood in the doorway. Daniel was sitting on the porch with a mug of tea. Next to him was Evelyn, on duty. Sora with a blueprint for a new counter for branch number 8. Yuna was sewing up someone's robe. Maddie with an account book. Haley had just returned from negotiations with the upper guild. Lena was sitting nearby. She leaned her shoulder against Daniel. A little silver-haired girl with a mug of iced tea with mint and honey. Marcus stood and watched. At the shop that had grown out of a sack and 200 copper coins, at the people gathered around the man he had driven out 2 years ago. At the sign. Handmart Underground, head office, a 3-story building with a display window and a line of customers. He stood there for a long time. Then he said 2 words. Dan. I was wrong. Daniel looked at him. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't offering cheap forgiveness. He just nodded toward an empty chair, said, "Sit down." He asked if he'd like some tea. Marcus sat down. Daniel poured him some tea. Marcus drank in silence. Above them, in the stone vault of the 38th floor, a second symbol slowly emerged, huge, glowing, just like the one on the wall behind Lena, only bigger, much bigger, like a seal on a cave ceiling. Lena didn't look up. She knew it was there. She said quietly, "Thank you. I've wanted someone to ask me what kind of tea I like for a long time." Daniel didn't understand, not yet, but he smiled. He looked at Marcus. He looked at his team. He looked at the bench. Then he said, "Tomorrow is the opening of branch number 15 on the 81st floor. We're submitting the application." Maddie opened her notebook. She began to count. Sora reached for a pencil. Evelyn nodded and checked her sword. Una smiled. Haley took out a blank parchment to write to the guild. Marcus sat with a mug of tea and watched them. The people who were working, who were building, who weren't waiting for a hero, who were just doing their jobs. Then he quietly asked if he could help.
Daniel looked at him, said he always could, said that tomorrow they needed to unload 3 caravans of supplies for the new branch. The work was hard, dirty, without glory, without titles, just hauling sacks. Marcus nodded, finished his tea, set down the mug, said he could handle it. Evening. The stone vault of the 38th floor. The moss glows green. The symbol on the ceiling pulsates with a warm light. Somewhere far below, the breath has frozen on the 81st floor. It doesn't rise. It doesn't fall. It waits. Somewhere far above on the surface of Aerdall, people are discussing for the first time not how to destroy the underground, but how to live in it. Between the top and the bottom, lights are glowing across all the floors. 15 soon. Small, warm, alive. Stalls, his shops, where anyone can walk in, get a fair price, clean water, warm tea, and not be cheated. Daniel Kim, 29 years old, former purchasing manager, former wagon driver, shopkeeper, god of the counter.
Administrator of the underworld. Though he doesn't know the latter yet. Not yet. But Lena knows. And the dungeon knows. And the symbols on the walls know. And somewhere in the very depths, on levels no human has ever seen, something ancient and immense and infinitely weary sighed for the first time in 1,000 years, not from pain, but from relief. Because finally, it wasn't a hero with a sword, but a man with a mug of tea. And he asked what kind she liked.